Hey everyone, today we're opening a 1970s kitchen where a harvest gold stove faced a formica counter. A paper grocery bag leaned against the bread box and 1 pound of ground beef waited beside a brightly printed cardboard box. The refrigerator hummed, the electric can opener stood ready, and dinner was expected before homework evening television or a parent's second shift of household work began. Today, we're bringing back 30 foods that many American families once treated as ordinary, comforting, fashionable, or wonderfully convenient, beginning with 2 meals that could turn a few pantry ingredients into enough supper for the whole table. Some viewers will remember these dishes with affection. Others may remember negotiating every last pea. Before we lift the skillet lid, please like and subscribe if you enjoy rediscovering the forgotten foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions that once filled American homes. Which food from the 1970s do you remember most clearly, and what meal did your family make when the grocery budget had to stretch a little farther? To qualify for this list, a food must have been strongly visible in the decade's kitchens, supermarkets, lunchrooms, potlucks, or family gatherings, even if its recipe began earlier or it still survives today. Our first food arrived with an unusually confident promise. Hamburger Helper suggested that meat did not have to carry dinner alone. A box of noodles, rice potatoes, or seasoning could stand beside a skillet and make one package of ground beef look considerably more ambitious. Hamburger Helper made its national debut in 1971 when families were becoming increasingly attentive to the price of meat and to the amount of time available between work, school errands, and supper. The earliest boxes offered several varieties rather than the single familiar flavor that memory sometimes invents, and the method was easy enough to learn from the back panel. Brown the beef, drain it if necessary, add the packaged ingredients with water or milk, then stir while the sauce thickened. The smell began with onions and beef hitting a hot skillet, followed by the salty, creamy aroma of seasoning powder dissolving into the pan. A wooden spoon scraped the bottom, noodles softened, and the mixture slowly changed from separate ingredients into something that could be spooned onto several plates. The box called itself a helper, though the cook still supplied the meat, the pan, the stove, the stirring, the side dish, and every plate that would later require washing. It was helpful in the way many convenience products were helpful. It reduced decisions more reliably than it reduced work. That reduction in decisions mattered. A parent standing in a supermarket aisle did not have to imagine an entire meal from scratch. The picture on the package had already performed the imagining. At home, the skillet could be adjusted to match the household. Some cooks added onions, canned tomatoes, frozen vegetables, extra noodles, or more water when another child appeared at the table. Others followed the box exactly because predictability was the point. Children often recognized the texture before they knew the variety, especially the soft noodles coated in a sauce that seemed designed to cling equally well to the spoon, the plate, and the front of a shirt. Hamburger Helper was not served in every home, and families with different regional or cultural food traditions had their own ways of stretching meat. Still, the box captured a central 1970s problem: how to make dinner feel complete when money, time, and attention were all being divided into smaller portions. Tuna noodle casserole answered the same problem from a quieter shelf of the pantry. It did not need a brightly branded meal kit because the household often assembled it from familiar parts: egg noodles, canned tuna, condensed cream, soup peas, milk, and something crisp for the top. Crushed potato chips, buttered breadcrumbs, crackers, or canned fried onions might provide the crunch depending on the recipe card and what remained in the cupboard. The casserole began with the sound of a can opener and the faint briny smell of tuna, followed by the thick slide of condensed soup leaving the can in one pale cylinder. Once stirred together, the mixture went into a glass baking dish and emerged bubbling at the edges with the topping browned just enough to suggest that this had been planned rather than assembled from emergency supplies. That distinction mattered. A casserole could make economical ingredients look orderly, generous, and suitable for the centre of the table. Many versions of tuna noodle casserole were already familiar before the 1970s, but the dish belonged naturally in that decade because it relied on the pantry, the freezer, and the belief that one baking dish could solve several household problems at once. It could be prepared ahead, carried to a neighbour, stretched with more noodles, and reheated when family members ate at different times. It also exposed the limits of family harmony. One child carefully removed every pea. Another objected to the tuna. Someone else wanted only the crunchy top, creating a small excavation site across the casserole dish. Yet the meal endured because it was practical, inexpensive, compared with many meat-centered dinners, and forgiving of substitutions. In some homes it carried a church supper feeling, in others it was simply Tuesday night. The recipe varied across regions and families, but the basic idea remained steady. Combine shelf-stable ingredients, add heat, and trust the casserole dish to create unity where the ingredients had shown little interest in achieving it themselves. Neither food has completely disappeared. Hamburger helper remains sold, and tuna noodle casserole still appears in family kitchens, community cookbooks, and comfort food conversations. What faded was their unquestioned place at the centre of ordinary weeknight life. Families gained more frozen choices, more takeout, more international flavours, faster appliances, and different ideas about processed sauces and canned ingredients. Household sizes and schedules changed as well, yet these two meals still summon a complete room, the box propped beside the stove, the casserole cooling beneath, foil the scrape of a serving spoon, and the question of whether there was enough for seconds. They remind us that convenience in the 1970s was rarely about doing nothing. It was about turning limited time and groceries into something that could still be called dinner. In the next kitchen, the cardboard box gives way to a glass baking dish where chicken rice and a surprisingly respectable stroganoff wait beneath the oven light. The glass baking dish did not look like a machine, but in many 1970s kitchens it performed the work of one. Into it went a layer of uncooked white rice, a can of condensed cream soup loosened with water or milk, perhaps a packet of dry onion seasoning, and several chicken pieces arranged across the top as neatly as the budget allowed. The dish might be clear glass, white patterned Corningware, or a metal pan that had already survived years of brownies and holiday stuffing. Once covered with foil and pushed into the oven, it asked for very little attention. The rice absorbed the liquid, the chicken released its juices, and the kitchen slowly filled with the warm smell of onions, poultry, and creamy sauce. From the outside, nothing appeared to be happening except a faint cloud gathering on the oven door. Inside, dinner was organizing itself. Chicken and rice casserole suited a household that needed time to continue moving after the oven door closed. A child could spread schoolbooks across the table. Laundry could be folded on the sofa. A parent could answer the telephone, check tomorrow's schedule, or finally sit down for 10 minutes while the refrigerator motor and the evening news supplied the background noise. There were many versions because the recipe was less a strict formula than a family agreement between meat starch, moisture, and patience. Some cooks used cream of mushroom soup, others cream of chicken or celery. Some added canned mushrooms, sliced almonds, paprika, frozen peas, or a few celery pieces for evidence that a vegetable had been consulted. Bone-in thighs and drumsticks were economical and flavourful, while breast pieces looked more orderly when company was expected. The danger was always the rice. Too little liquid left hard grains hiding beneath the chicken. Too much produced something closer to porridge. A successful casserole made the cook look calm. The unsuccessful version kept everyone chewing thoughtfully. The meal also carried the particular logic of the one-dish supper. It reduced the number of pans, but it did not erase the work surrounding dinner. Someone still trimmed the chicken, measured the liquid, wiped the counter, opened the cans, set the table, found a vegetable, and decided whether the browned skin was worth removing the foil near the end. Yet the baking dish gathered the main ingredients into one dependable centre, and that mattered when family schedules were becoming less uniform. A portion could be held for someone arriving late, spooned into a smaller dish for a neighbour, or reheated the next day when the rice had absorbed even more of the sauce. In some homes, the casserole was plain comfort food. In others, it was a way of making inexpensive chicken pieces seem generous. The food did not demand admiration. It simply occupied the middle of the table, steaming beneath the ceiling light, while everyone decided which piece of chicken had the most meat. A few pages farther into the recipe box, dinner acquired a more impressive name. Beef stroganoff sounded like something that should arrive from a restaurant beneath a silver cover, yet the version familiar to many American families could begin with ground beef, an onion, a can of mushroom soup, and a carton of sour cream. The dish had older Russian roots, but American home cooks often met a simplified adaptation, shaped by supermarket ingredients and the weeknight clock. In a more elaborate version, thin strips of beef browned in butter, beside sliced mushrooms, before broth and seasonings created the sauce. In the budget version, ground beef broke apart beneath a wooden spoon and stretched across a broad bed of egg noodles. Either way, sour cream entered near the end, turning the gravy pale, smooth, and faintly tangy. If added over excessive heat, it could separate an outcome that made the sauce look alarmed even when it still tasted perfectly acceptable. Stroganoff offered families a useful piece of theatre. The ingredients could be ordinary, but the name sounded worldly, especially during a decade when cookbooks, magazines, and supermarket products encouraged Americans to try domesticated versions of international dishes. A bowl of buttered noodles waited beside the skillet, wide and soft enough to catch the mushroom sauce. Parsley might be scattered over the top when presentation mattered. A serving spoon carried the mixture to the plate in one heavy motion, and the cook could call it beef stroganoff, rather than ground beef with gravy, which was accurate but lacked occasion. Families varied the recipe freely. Some used steak strips when the grocery budget permitted. Some added Worcestershire sauce, bouillon, garlic ketchup, or canned mushrooms. Others avoided mushrooms entirely because one child had declared them suspicious. The dish could therefore be formal enough for guests, economical enough for Wednesday, and flexible enough to survive the strongest opinion at the table. Neither chicken and rice casserole nor American-style stroganoff was exclusive to the 1970s, and neither truly vanished afterward. What changed was the confidence once placed in the glass baking dish, the condensed soup can, and the idea that a respectable family dinner could be built from a few standardized ingredients without apology. Later households gained more takeout choices, more frozen entrees, newer appliances, and a broader range of supermarket flavors. Still, these meals remain powerful memory machines. One recalls the foil lifting from a pan of tender chicken and rice. The other brings back the cool spoonful of sour cream disappearing into brown mushroom gravy. Both turned practical ingredients into food that seemed complete, and both allowed the cook to offer comfort without explaining how carefully time and money had been arranged behind it. Soon, however, even the baking dish would become optional. The freezer door was opening, and behind its frost waited a Salisbury steak in a divided tray, and a small chicken pot pie with gravy hot enough to delay the first bite. The freezer door opened with a small pull against the frost, and behind the ice tray sat a stack of flat cardboard packages with photographs far more orderly than anything waiting in the refrigerator. In many 1970s homes, the Salisbury steak television dinner was the package that looked most like a complete meal. A moulded patty rested beneath brown gravy, mashed potatoes occupied one compartment, peas or corn waited in another, and sometimes a small dessert sat at the edge as though it had been granted its own room. The tray was usually covered with foil, and the instructions required the cook to peel back one corner, cut a slit, or uncover the dessert at the proper moment. Nothing about it was instant. The oven still needed time to heat, the frozen tray needed time to bake, and a hungry child needed to be persuaded that staring through the oven window did not speed the process. Even so, dinner had arrived already divided, seasoned, portioned, and named. Salisbury steak was not simply a hamburger wearing gravy, although that was how some children understood it. The patty was usually made from finely ground beef formed into an oval and served with a dark onion or mushroom-style sauce. On the frozen tray it carried the appearance of a small restaurant entree, especially when the box showed the gravy shining beneath perfect studio lighting. At home, the reality was softer around the edges. The potatoes might form a pale mound with the surface slightly dry from the oven. The vegetables could remain surprisingly hot long after the meat had cooled. Gravy found its way beneath the foil and occasionally into a neighbouring compartment, breaking the tray's promise that every food would respect its boundary. Yet that separation was part of the attraction. A child who disliked peas could regard them from a safe distance. An adult eating late after work could eat one portion without reopening the entire evening's dinner plan. The tray turned a family meal into a personal assignment. The phrase television dinner had already been part of American life before the 1970s, but the idea fit the decade especially well. Families were buying more frozen foods, supermarkets were devoting more space to freezer cases, and evening schedules did not always gather everyone around the table at the same time. In some homes, the tray was carried to a folding table in front of the television. In others, it was placed on a dinner plate because eating directly from foil felt too temporary. A parent might keep several packages for nights when cooking plans collapse for a teenager arriving after practice, or for an adult whose work shift ended after everyone else had eaten. The meal offered control, one box, one serving, very little preparation, and no argument about who had taken the largest piece. It also created its own small inconveniences. The foil tray bent when lifted carelessly, the gravy retained volcanic heat, and the photograph on the carton remained the only version in which the mashed potatoes stood perfectly upright. Beside the larger dinner boxes, the individual frozen chicken pot pie offered a different kind of comfort. It came in a shallow foil pan beneath a printed carton, its top crust pale firm, and often dusted with frost when removed from the freezer. After enough time in the oven, the crust rose and browned around the edges while thick gravy pushed against small cracks in the surface. The first cut released steam carrying the smell of chicken, pepper, pastry and cooked vegetables. Beneath the crust were small pieces of meat, peas, carrots, potatoes or celery suspended in sauce. The contents were rarely distributed with complete fairness. One half might hold most of the chicken, while the other offered several determined peas and a great deal of gravy. The pie therefore encouraged a careful excavation. Children broke through the crust, lifted a corner and waited for the filling to cool, often ignoring the warning and discovering that gravy could remain hotter than the metal pan holding it. The personal size made the pot pie feel generous even when it was economical. Unlike a casserole spooned from a common dish, each person received a complete round crust with no visible evidence that someone else had been served first. Several pies could bake side by side, perhaps in different flavors, allowing a household to appear to offer choices without preparing separate meals from scratch. They were useful when the pantry was nearly empty, when a parent was ill, when snow or rain discouraged another grocery trip, or when the family schedule had separated into several smaller dinners. Some households added a salad, canned fruit, or bread. Others treated the pie as fully self-contained, which was optimistic but understandable. A fork, a napkin, and a glass of milk could make the table seem prepared. The foil pan went into the trash afterward, reducing cleanup at a time when convenience still meant avoiding one dirty dish wherever possible. Frozen Salisbury steak dinners and chicken pot pies never vanished completely, but their place in family life changed. Microwave-safe packaging eventually shortened the wait. Larger selections of frozen meals competed for freezer space, and takeout offered another answer to the broken dinner schedule. Some consumers also began looking for different textures, less gravy, or meals that appeared fresher than food sealed beneath foil. Yet the memory of these packages remains unusually physical. The cold cardboard against a hand, the tearing sound of the foil, the tray balanced on an oven rack, and the long pause before the first bite. They promised more than convenience. They offered the feeling that dinner had been settled. No recipe had to be found, no portions had to be negotiated, and no leftover had to be transformed into something new. When the trays were finally cleared, the freezer still held another familiar answer. On a baking sheet nearby, fish sticks were beginning to crisp while a skillet of sweet, messy, sloppy Joe filling waited for soft buns and a family willing to use both hands. The baking sheet came out of the oven carrying a row of nearly identical golden rectangles, each one crisp at the corners and pale beneath the breading where the heat had not quite reached. Fish sticks were among the most recognizable freezer suppers of the 1970s because they removed nearly everything unpredictable about fish. There were no bones to inspect, no skin to remove, and no whole creature looking back from the plate. A parent opened the cardboard box, arranged the frozen pieces in straight lines, and waited while the kitchen filled with the mild smell of toasted crumbs and hot cooking oil. Beside them might sit a bowl of tartar sauce, a bottle of ketchup, canned peas, frozen corn, or oven-baked French fries sharing the same metal tray. For many children, this was not really fish in the adult sense. It was a dependable shape that happened to come from the sea. That predictability mattered in households where seafood could be expensive, regional, difficult to prepare, or unpopular with younger eaters. Frozen fish sticks made it possible to serve fish without planning an entire meal around the fish counter. They waited behind the freezer door until the grocery budget, the calendar, or a religious meatless day brought them forward. Some families served them on Fridays. Others used them whenever dinner needed to reach the table with very little discussion. School cafeterias also helped make the shape familiar, though menus varied widely from one district to another. The cafeteria version might arrive beside instant mashed potatoes, canned green beans, or a small carton of milk, its breading softened during the journey from kitchen to tray. At home, the same food could be crispier, especially when someone remembered to turn the pieces halfway through baking. That small act separated the carefully browned fish stick from the one with a damp underside that remained attached to the pan. The sauces often carried more personality than the fish itself. Tartar sauce added relish mayonnaise and a sharp pickle smell that made the meal feel slightly grown up. Ketchup offered children a safer arrangement, usually in a red pool large enough to disguise several vegetables as well. Lemon wedges appeared in homes where presentation mattered, although the lemon was sometimes left untouched while every drop of ketchup disappeared. The meal created its own dinner table negotiations. How many fish sticks counted as a serving? Could a child receive another before finishing the peas? Was it acceptable to peel away the breading and leave the fish behind? These were not major conflicts, but they were exactly the kind that shaped ordinary family meals. Fish sticks survived because they were inexpensive, easy to store, and difficult to ruin completely. Even when slightly overbaked, they remained edible. That was a useful quality in a kitchen where the telephone could ring, a child could need help with homework, and the oven timer could become only one sound among many. Across the kitchen, the skillet offered a meal with almost the opposite personality. Sloppy Joes refused clean edges, careful compartments, and orderly bites. Ground beef browned with chopped onion before tomato sauce ketchup. Prepared seasoning or canned sandwich sauce turned it into a sweet tangy mixture that had no intention of remaining inside a bun. Some families made the sauce entirely from pantry ingredients, adjusting the sweetness with brown sugar or the sharpness with mustard and vinegar. Others opened a can designed specifically for the job. The mixture simmered until it thickened enough to be spooned onto soft white hamburger buns, although thick enough was a flexible standard. The first bite usually pushed the filling toward the back of the sandwich. The second sent it over the sides. By the third, the plate had become essential equipment. Sloppy Joes were useful because ground beef could be stretched with sauce onions and occasionally other additions without looking as though the family was eating leftovers. One skillet could feed several people, and the serving size could be adjusted with the spoon. A larger child received a heavier sandwich. A younger one received half a bun and still managed to wear some of it. The meal appeared at weeknight tables, school cafeterias, birthday gatherings, church events, and casual neighborhood suppers because it was warm, familiar, and easy to make in quantity. Potato chips often sat beside it, their crispness providing a contrast to the soft bun and saucy meat. Pickle slices, coleslaw, baked beans, or carrot sticks might complete the plate. The sandwich required no knife, but it demanded napkins. A wise parent placed several within reach before anyone began. An optimistic parent placed one beside each plate and learned from the experience. The name also allowed regional and family differences to hide beneath one broad label. Some households remembered a sweeter filling, while others preferred more tomato, pepper, or onion. Similar loose meat sandwiches existed under other names and with different seasonings, and not every family would have recognized one exact recipe as the correct Sloppy Joe. What remained consistent was the practical appeal. It was ground beef made abundant through sauce served on inexpensive bread and presented as a complete dish rather than a compromise. Children often liked it because the flavor was mild and sweet. Adults liked it because it could be prepared quickly and held warm for someone arriving late. The skillet could remain on low heat while the household moved around it, each person assembling a sandwich when ready. Fish sticks and Sloppy Joes still exist, but they no longer occupy quite the same unquestioned place in the weeknight rotation. Supermarket freezer cases now hold countless breaded seafood options, while takeout and ready-made meals compete with the skillet sandwich. Families have also become accustomed to a wider range of seasonings, breads, and quick dinner choices. Yet both foods preserve a clear 1970s memory because each solved dinner in a recognizable way. Fish sticks made seafood safe, square, and countable. Sloppy Joes made a small amount of ground beef look generous and turned cleanup into part of the experience. One arrived in straight frozen rows, the other spread across the plate. Together they represented two reliable answers to the same household question: what could be served quickly, affordably, and with at least a reasonable chance that the children would eat it. The next answer waited in a deeper pot where macaroni rice and ground beef were being asked to feed more people than the meat could have managed alone. The macaroni entered the pot because the ground beef could not be expected to do everything. In many 1970s, kitchens chili mac began with a heavy skillet or deep saucepan, a chopped onion, and a modest amount of hamburger broken apart with a wooden spoon. Tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, chili powder beans in some homes, and elbow macaroni in nearly all of them turned the meat into something larger, warmer, and capable of filling more bowls. The noodles absorbed the red sauce until they carried the flavour into every spoonful, while steam clouded the kitchen window and the refrigerator motor clicked on behind the cook. Nothing about the dish required a perfect cut of meat or an elaborate plan. It required enough liquid, enough seasoning, and the judgment to know when the macaroni had softened without surrendering completely. The result sat somewhere between chili goulash and casserole, depending on the family, the region, and the recipe card. Every household seemed to recognize the idea, even when no two households agreed on the name. Chili mac worked because macaroni was inexpensive, shelf-stable, familiar to children, and willing to absorb almost any flavour placed around it. A pound of ground beef that might have produced 4 hamburgers could now travel through a much larger pot supported by pasta, tomatoes, beans, or whatever else the pantry offered. Some cooks prepared the macaroni separately and stirred it into finished chili. Others allowed it to cook directly in the sauce, saving a pan but creating the small risk that the noodles would drink every available drop of liquid. Grated cheese might be scattered over each bowl, melting into orange threads beneath the spoon. Crackers, white bread, or cornbread could stand nearby for anyone who felt the meal needed one more starch, a concern rarely left unresolved in a 1970s family kitchen. Children often liked chili mac because the noodles softened the stronger spices and made the dish look less intimidating than a bowl of ordinary chili. Adults appreciated that leftovers usually tasted better the next day, after the flavours had settled and the macaroni had expanded enough to suggest that the pot had somehow refilled itself overnight. The dish also adapted to the exact condition of the grocery budget. When meat was plentiful, the skillet tasted rich and beefy. When money was tight, more macaroni went into the pot, followed by another can of tomatoes or beans. A careful cook could make the adjustment without announcing it. The family simply received larger bowls and perhaps more bread. This was one of the quiet skills behind many budget meals, stretching an ingredient without making the meal feel thin. Chili mac looked abundant because it arrived as one unified dish, rather than as several small portions arranged apologetically on a plate. The sauce coated everything, equally concealing the household arithmetic. It could feed children before an evening school event, remain warm for a parent arriving late, or be carried to a neighbour in a covered casserole dish. The meal was casual, forgiving, and nearly impossible to serve elegantly. A spoonful landed where it pleased, cheese clung to the bowl, and a drop of tomato sauce usually found the cleaner shirt at the table. That too was part of its reliability. Rice performed the same stretching work in porcupine meatballs, although it did so more quietly and with a better visual trick. Ground beef was mixed with uncooked rice, onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes an egg or a small amount of milk before being rolled into compact balls. These were placed in a skillet, Dutch oven, or casserole dish beneath tomato sauce, tomato soup, or another seasoned liquid. As the meatballs simmered, the rice cooked and pushed outward through the surface, creating the little white points that gave the dish its memorable name. Children who might have ignored an ordinary meatball could be persuaded to inspect one called a porcupine. The resemblance was not exact, but dinner table naming has never required scientific precision. What mattered was that the rice could be seen, the sauce smelled warm and sweet, and the food arrived with the story built into its appearance. Porcupine meatballs made a small amount of beef feel more substantial, without placing a separate mound of rice beside it. The grain was hidden inside the meat, absorbing liquid and flavour as the dish cooked. Some versions used a sweet tomato sauce, while others leaned towards savoury gravy or condensed soup. Some families baked the meatballs beneath foil. Others simmered them slowly on the stove where the sauce could be checked with a spoon and adjusted before it thickened too far. The practical danger was the rice. If the meatballs were packed too tightly or the cooking liquid ran low, a few grains might remain firm at the centre producing an unexpected crunch in an otherwise tender bite. A successful batch came apart easily beneath a fork, leaving a trail of tomato sauce across mashed potatoes, green beans, or a slice of bread. The meatballs could be counted, which made portions look fair, but their size remained negotiable. A cook feeding several children could roll them smaller and produce a platter that appeared impressively full. Like chili mac porcupine meatballs belong to a much older tradition of combining scarce or expensive meat with grains, bread, vegetables, or other extenders. The 1970s did not invent that household logic. The decade simply provided another setting in which it remained useful. Grocery prices shifted, family schedules became more complicated, and cooks continued looking for meals that could simmer, hold, reheat, and feed several people without demanding premium ingredients. Community cookbooks, recipe boxes, and magazine pages carried countless versions of these dishes because they were easy to describe and easier to adapt. One family added Worcestershire sauce. Another used canned tomato soup because it was always in the pantry. A third remembered the meatballs from a school cafeteria or a relative's supper table rather than from home. Such differences mattered because no single recipe represented every American kitchen. The shared memory was not one exact seasoning. It was the sight of rice points emerging from a meatball and the understanding that dinner had been stretched without being diminished. Chili mac and porcupine meatballs have not disappeared, but they now compete with boxed meals, frozen entrees, restaurant delivery, and a much wider range of quick family dinners. Their names may sound old-fashioned, yet the need they answered remains familiar. Both meals asked ground beef to support more people than it could have managed alone. Macaroni did the work, openly filling the pot with curves and elbows. Rice disappeared inside the meatball and revealed itself only after cooking. One dish was loose red and spooned into bowls. The other arrived in counted portions beneath sauce. Together they showed how economy could become part of a meal's identity without becoming its entire story. Families remembered the warmth, the smell, the generous pot, and the peculiar little meatballs before they remembered the calculation behind them. At the next table, another vegetable would be asked to perform a structural duty. A green bell pepper would stand upright in a baking dish, while nearby a paper bag of seasoned crumbs waited for someone to shake the chicken. The green bell pepper stood upright in the baking dish like a vegetable that had been promoted to cookware. Its top had been cut away, its seeds and pale ribs removed, and the hollow centre waited for a mixture of ground beef, rice, onion, and tomato sauce. In many 1970s, kitchen stuffed peppers offered a practical answer to two familiar problems: how to stretch meat and how to place a vegetable at the centre of dinner without anyone overlooking it. The peppers were often blanched or partially cooked before filling, then arranged closely enough that they supported one another while baking. A spoon pressed the meat and rice mixture into each opening tomato sauce ran over the tops, and a glass or metal pan carried the whole arrangement into the oven. When the dish returned, the peppers had softened, the sauce had darkened around the edges, and the kitchen smelled of tomatoes, onions, and roasted green pepper, an aroma that announced dinner long before anyone was called to the table. The filling changed according to region, family taste, and the condition of the refrigerator. Some cooks used uncooked rice and allowed it to absorb the sauce during baking, while others mixed in leftover cooked rice from an earlier meal. Ground beef was common, but sausage, chopped leftover meat, or a mostly rice-based filling could appear when the budget required it. Canned tomatoes, tomato soup, or bottled sauce supplied moisture. Shredded cheese sometimes covered the top near the end, giving the peppers a browned finish that made them look slightly more festive. The pepper itself served as both ingredient and portion guide. One large pepper could become an adult serving, while a smaller child might receive half and immediately begin removing the filling from its green container. The dish was economical, but it did not look like a collection of scraps. 4 or 6 filled peppers arranged in a pan appeared orderly, complete, and almost architectural, which gave the cook a useful advantage before anyone had tasted them. Children's opinions about stuffed peppers were rarely architectural. The filling was familiar enough, but the green shell could taste bitter soft or suspiciously healthy. Some children ate the center and left the pepper standing like an empty cup. Others sliced everything together and discovered that the tomato sauce made the vegetable easier to accept. The meal therefore created a quiet negotiation between presentation and preference. A parent could point out that the pepper was part of the dinner, not merely its packaging. A child could argue without using those exact words that edible packaging remained optional. Yet stuffed peppers endured because they reheated well, could be prepared ahead, and turned a limited amount of meat into several clearly defined servings. They also carried traces of many older culinary traditions, so no single 1970s recipe represented every household. What many families shared was the basic transformation. An inexpensive vegetable became its own serving dish, and ordinary filling gained a more respectable appearance simply by standing upright. On another evening, the chicken did not stand upright at all. It went into a bag. A packet of seasoned crumbs was emptied into the plastic pouch provided with shake and bake. A chicken piece followed, and the open end was twisted or held firmly before the shaking began. The motion was simple enough that children were sometimes allowed to help, which turned dinner preparation into a brief household performance. The bag bounced between 2 hands, crumbs flew against the plastic, and everyone inspected the chicken afterward to see whether the coating had reached every side. A bare patch required another shake. Too much enthusiasm could loosen the grip at the top and test how widely seasoned crumbs could travel across a kitchen floor. The product made a traditional cooking step feel organized and modern. No bowl of flour, no separate egg wash, no frying pan full of hot grease, and no uncertainty about which seasonings belonged in the coating. Once coated, the chicken pieces were arranged on a baking sheet or shallow pan, and placed in the oven until the crumbs browned and the skin or meat beneath had cooked through. Drumsticks and thighs worked especially well because they were affordable, flavorful, and easy to divide among family members. The smell differed from fried chicken. It was drier, toastier, and heavy with packaged seasoning rather than hot oil. The coating could become crisp along the edges while remaining softer where the chicken touched the pan. A careful cook turned the pieces or arranged them with enough space for heat to circulate. A hurried cook placed them close together and accepted whatever texture emerged. Side dishes were usually uncomplicated: mashed potatoes, canned corn, green beans, coleslaw, or a boxed macaroni dish. The chicken arrived looking familiar enough to please the family, but different enough to suggest that an advertised kitchen improvement had taken place. The appeal of shake and bake was not that it removed every task. Someone still handled raw chicken, opened the packet, held the bag arranged. The pieces watched the oven and washed the pan afterward. Its real convenience was consistency. The seasoning had already been measured, the breading had already been blended, and the instructions were printed directly on the package. A cook did not have to decide how much salt, pepper, paprika, or crumb mixture to use. The box reduced the number of choices between opening the refrigerator and serving dinner. That mattered in a decade when packaged foods increasingly promised not only speed but confidence. A person with little cooking experience could produce chicken that appeared deliberate. A tired parent could avoid heating a skillet of oil. A child could participate in one visible step and later claim partial ownership of the meal, especially if the shaking had been dramatic enough. Stuffed peppers and crumb-coated chicken represented 2 different forms of 1970s practicality. The peppers used an older household method: combine meat with rice, place it inside a vegetable, and let the oven stretch both ingredients into a complete supper. Shake and Bake used a newer package system, place the meat inside a bag, follow the printed steps and allow a branded mixture to supply the flavour. One dish depended on a recipe remembered, copied or adjusted over time. The other depended on a box that promised the same result from one shopping trip to the next. Neither has disappeared, but both have become less central, as family dinners have multiplied into countless quicker options. Their memories remain attached to physical actions, pressing, filling into a green pepper, twisting the top of a plastic bag, shaking chicken beneath the kitchen light, and opening the oven to inspect the browning. Across the pantry, another packaged meal was waiting. This one required 2 cans, a paper bag of crunchy noodles, and a very American idea of what chow mein should look like. The 2 cans were fastened together so neatly that they looked like one unusually tall piece of kitchen equipment. In many 1970s supermarkets, canned chow mein or chop suey appeared beside bottles of soy sauce, cans of bean sprouts, and packages of crisp fried noodles, promising a complete Chinese-style dinner without a restaurant, a wok, or much chopping. The larger can commonly held vegetables such as bean sprouts, celery, onions, and small pieces of carrot, while the smaller portion supplied meat and thick brown sauce. At home, the cans were separated, opened, drained, or combined according to the label, and emptied into a saucepan. The mixture heated, slowly releasing a salty smell of gravy, canned vegetables, and seasoning. Then came the most important part, the crisp noodles. They were poured over the top at the last moment, because without that crunch, the meal would have been a bowl of very soft vegetables, asking the family to use its imagination. Brands such as Chun King and Le Choy had been selling highly Americanized Chinese food long before the 1970s. But the supermarket package remained especially memorable during that decade. It offered many families an introduction not to the full range of Chinese or Chinese-American cooking, but to a shelf-stable product designed for mainstream grocery stores and cautious home cooks. The distinction matters. Chinese-American restaurants had developed rich regional traditions, and Chinese families prepared foods far more varied than anything sealed in a national brand can. The packaged version was something else, a consumer product shaped by long storage mass distribution advertising, and the expectation that unfamiliar food should arrive with simple English instructions. For households with little access to Chinese restaurants or specialty ingredients, the cans could still feel unusual and exciting. Dinner did not look like meatloaf macaroni or a casserole. It came with crispy noodles, soy sauce, and a name that suggested the kitchen had travelled much farther than the grocery cart actually had. Preparation required little skill, but it offered several important decisions. Some cooks served the hot mixture over white rice, then scattered fried noodles across the top. Others skipped the rice and used enough crunchy noodles to form a brittle foundation beneath the sauce. A bottle of soy sauce stood on the table, allowing each person to increase the saltiness with confidence. Additional canned mushrooms, water chestnuts, bamboo shoots, or bean sprouts might be added when the pantry contained them. In some households, homemade chicken or browned ground beef was stirred into a vegetable product to make the meal feel more substantial. The saucepan bubbled while rice steamed in another pot, and the paper or plastic bag of noodles remained closed until everyone was ready. Opening it too soon invited humidity to begin its work. The family wanted the noodles crisp enough to crack beneath the spoon, at least before the gravy softened them into a completely different food. The texture was the meal's main drama. The vegetables were tender, sometimes remarkably so after canning and reheating. Celery and bean sprouts remained visible, but their original crunch had become mostly a memory. The sauce was thick enough to coat a spoon, and mild enough for diners who did not expect much heat. Against that softness, the fried noodles snapped loudly during the first few bites, Children could concentrate on the crunchy pieces and cautiously investigate the vegetables beneath them. Adults might add soy sauce, pepper, or more rice. If the meal sat too long, however, the contrast disappeared. The noodles absorbed the gravy bent under the spoon and became soft strands or small swollen fragments. Canned chow mein therefore had a brief perfect moment between assembly and surrender. A wise cook called everyone to the table before adding the noodles. A distracted household discovered that crispness, like punctuality, could not be restored once lost. Advertising presented these products as an easy way to bring variety into the American home. That promise had real appeal. A family could place something different on the table without locating unfamiliar fresh ingredients, learning a new cooking technique, or persuading everyone to visit a restaurant. The package reduced another cuisine to a safe sequence: open, heat, serve, and sprinkle. It also turned difference into entertainment. Children might attempt chopsticks for several minutes before returning to forks. A parent could set out small bowls and call the evening special, even though the cans had been purchased during the same trip as cereal, laundry detergent, and canned peaches. For some families, this was an occasional novelty rather than a weekly meal. Others relied on it during busy evenings because it remained in the pantry and could be prepared quickly. Either way, the food's memory often includes the feeling of departure. The ordinary kitchen remained unchanged, but the meal announced that tonight was not quite the usual dinner. That feeling could coexist with disappointment. The image on the label might show generous pieces of chicken surrounded by bright vegetables, while the saucepan revealed mostly sprouts, celery, and sauce. Family members searched with the serving spoon, hoping to locate the meat that packaging photography had implied was waiting everywhere. The meal could be described as mild, salty, soft, comforting, strange, or deeply unconvincing sometimes by different people at the same table. Yet criticism should not erase what the product represented. It gave cooks another shelf-stable option, at a time when national brands were promising that variety no longer required additional labor. It also reveals how American supermarkets once packaged ethnicity for a mass audience, simplifying names, textures, and flavors into products that seemed adventurous without becoming too unfamiliar. Some viewers remember canned chow mein fondly because it was their first hint that dinner could taste different. Others remember the crispy noodles and would prefer to leave the rest inside the can. Canned chow mein lost much of its cultural prominence as Chinese restaurants became more accessible in many communities. Supermarket ingredient selections expanded, and American diners encountered a broader range of Chinese and other Asian cuisines. Takeout containers increasingly replaced stacked cans when families wanted a convenient change from ordinary supper. The packaged meal did not vanish entirely, but it began to feel like a specific relic of pantry-based convenience: 2 cans, 1 saucepan rice on the stove, and a final shower of noodles expected to provide both texture and excitement. Its place in memory is therefore larger than its flavor. It recalls a period when the supermarket aisle could present a distant cuisine as a complete domestic adventure, sealed, labeled, and ready to heat. The next forgotten foods would remove the saucepan altogether. On the dining table, long forks waited beside a pot of melted cheese, while a carefully sliced quiche suggested that ordinary eggs had suddenly become fashionable enough for company. The fondue pot sat in the center of the table like a small appliance demanding everyone's cooperation. Beneath it, a candle or can of fuel kept the cheese warm, while long-handled forks reached inward from every direction. Bread cubes waited in a basket cut neatly enough to spear, but not so small that they disappeared beneath the surface. In many 1970s, Home's cheese fondue was more than melted cheese. It was an event, a piece of tabletop theatre that allowed an ordinary dining room to feel briefly European, fashionable, and wonderfully modern. The pot might be bright orange, avocado green, or deep brown with matching forks marked by coloured tips, so each guest could remember which one had just returned from the cheese. The arrangement looked simple: melt cheese, add wine or another liquid place bread nearby, and invite everyone to participate. In practice, the mixture had to remain smooth, warm, and fluid without separating, scorching, or turning into a stubborn ball around the spoon. Dinner had become entertainment, but the host was still responsible for the machinery. Fondue appealed to a decade fascinated by specialized appliances and communal food. Department stores, gift catalogues, and bridal registries offered sets that promised conversation, along with dinner, and the design made the pot attractive enough to remain visible between parties. Families who had little reason to use a fondue set every week could still bring it out when neighbours visited, or relatives came for the evening. The food encouraged a slower kind of eating. Each person speared a bread cube, lowered it into the cheese, rotated the fork and lifted it carefully while a thin strand stretched back toward the pot. Someone inevitably lost a piece of bread beneath the surface. This created a small search operation involving several forks and more attention than the missing cube deserved. Some households attached playful rules or penalties to such mistakes. Others simply allowed the bread to remain at the bottom until cleanup revealed how many guests had failed the same basic task. The cheese itself varied according to ambition and availability. Traditional European recipes might call for particular cheeses, wine garlic, and careful temperature control, but American home versions often adapted to the supermarket shelf. Cheddar could replace harder-to-find cheeses. Beer broth or milk might replace wine. A packet cookbook recipe or appliance booklet could guide the cook through the process, promising smooth results if the instructions were followed and offering very little comfort if they were not. Bread was the standard dipper, but apple pieces, cooked vegetables, small sausages, or cubes of meat could appear around the pot. The meal looked generous because the ingredients covered the table in several bowls, even when the actual amount of cheese was modest. Fondue also transferred some work from the kitchen to the guests. Everyone cooked, dipped, watched, and waited together. This felt informal and social, although it required the entire group to coordinate around one hot container and agree that dinner should proceed one cube at a time. Quiche Lorraine offered a different kind of sophistication. It arrived already complete, a round pastry shell filled with eggs, cream cheese and bacon, or another smoked pork ingredient, its surface lightly browned and firm enough to slice into wedges. The dish had European roots and many variations, but the American version seen in 1970s, magazines, restaurants and home kitchens often carried a broad message: eggs were no longer limited to breakfast. Placed beside a green salad, chilled fruit, or a basket of rolls, quiche could become lunch and brunch company supper, or the centerpiece of a gathering where a casserole might have seemed too ordinary. The ingredients were familiar, yet the French name and pastry crust changed their social position. Bacon and eggs in a skillet belonged to morning. Bacon and eggs inside a carefully fluted crust could be served to guests at noon, and discussed as though the household had made an important culinary decision. The practical appeal was stronger than the fashion suggested. Quiche could be prepared before visitors arrived, served warm or near room temperature, and divided into tidy portions without last-minute work at the stove. A host could place it on the table, add a salad, and remain in the room rather than disappearing into the kitchen. Leftovers fit easily into the refrigerator and could return the next day as lunch. The filling also invited adaptation. Spinach, mushrooms, onions, broccoli, ham, or several cheeses could be added according to the season, the recipe, or what needed to be used before it spoiled. Frozen pie crusts and prepared pastry reduced the most intimidating step, allowing cooks who had no interest in rolling dough to produce something that still appeared homemade. The danger was hidden in the center. A quiche removed too early might look set at the edges while remaining liquid beneath the knife. One baked too long became firm and dry. The proper result required enough patience to let the custard settle and enough restraint not to keep checking it every 2 minutes. Not every household served fondue or quiche, and both foods were more visible in some middle-class entertaining circles than in the everyday routines of American families as a whole. Their importance lies partly in what they represented. Supermarkets were offering a wider range of ingredients, magazines were presenting international dishes in approachable forms, and home entertaining increasingly included food that guests could discuss as well as eat. These dishes allowed hosts to display curiosity without abandoning familiar flavors. Melted cheese bread eggs, bacon and pastry were hardly threatening ingredients. They had simply been reorganized and renamed. Fondue turned cheese into a group activity. Quiche turned breakfast ingredients into a luncheon centerpiece. Both made the table feel modern, without requiring the family to become entirely unfamiliar with dinner. Their visibility eventually faded. Fondue sets moved from dining tables to upper cabinets, where long forks became tangled with other special occasion equipment. Quiche remained common in cafes, bakeries, and brunch menus, but it lost some of the novelty that once made a slice seem like evidence of worldly taste. Home entertaining became less formal in many households, and new party foods took their place beside changing schedules and broader restaurant choices. Yet the memory of these dishes remains attached to presentation, the small flame beneath the fondue pot. The coloured fork handles the dangerous thread of hot cheese, and the clean triangular slice of quiche resting beside lettuce on a patterned plate. They recall a moment when dinner could become fashionable through arrangement alone. The next party foods would be less refined, but even harder to forget. In a slow cooker across the room, meatballs were beginning to shine beneath a sauce made from chili sauce and grape jelly, while small sausages waited to be wrapped in refrigerated dough. The slow cooker stood at the edge of the buffet table with its brown or harvest gold lid slightly fogged from within. When the lid lifted, steam carried the smell of warm spices, cooked meat, and a sweetness that guests could not immediately identify. Inside were cocktail meatballs coated in a dark red glaze made from chili sauce and grape jelly, a combination that sounded like a mistake until the heat melted both ingredients into something glossy, tangy, and strangely persuasive. The meatballs might have been homemade earlier that morning or poured directly from a frozen bag depending on the household and the size of the gathering. Either way, the slow cooker kept them warm, while the host arranged crackers, paper napkins, cheese cubes, and small plates around them. A container of toothpicks stood nearby because these were not meatballs meant for spaghetti. They were party food, designed to be collected one at a time while guests remained standing and attempted not to drip sauce onto the carpet. The recipe reflected a particular kind of convenience cooking that flourished in 1970s American homes. Two unlikely supermarket products could be combined, heated, and transformed into a dish that tasted more complicated than the preparation suggested. The jelly supplied sugar and fruit acidity. The chili sauce added tomatoes, vinegar, and seasoning. As the mixture warmed, it thinned enough to coat the meatballs before slowly reducing into a sticky glaze. Some families added mustard, lemon juice, Worcestershire sauce, or another seasoning to make the sweetness less obvious. Others trusted the two-ingredient formula completely. The cook did not need to prepare a traditional sauce stand beside the stove or serve the food at one exact moment. The slow cooker held the dish for hours, which made it useful for open houses, holiday gatherings, office parties, church events, and evenings when guests arrived. According to their own interpretation of the invitation time, convenience was not merely speed. It was the ability to keep dinner waiting without showing that it had been waiting. The meatballs quickly developed a life of their own at the party. The first guests approached cautiously, especially if they had heard what was in the sauce. One bite usually settled the argument. The sweetness was noticeable, but the tomato and vinegar prevented the glaze from tasting like dessert. Children often liked them because the portions were small and the sauce was mild. Adults could eat several while insisting they were only sampling. Toothpicks accumulated on plates, in ashtrays repurposed as holders, or in small dishes that someone had wisely placed beside the cooker. The practical difficulty was retrieving a meatball without pushing 3 others beneath the sauce. A guest leaned over the pot, aimed carefully, and lifted the prize through a shining trail that could stretch from cooker to plate. The dish required almost no ceremony, yet it created a steady centre of activity. People returned to it while talking, carrying another meatball away each time as though the previous one had not counted. Across the table, pigs in a blanket offered a less mysterious combination. Small cocktail sausages were wrapped in strips of refrigerated dough and baked until the pastry turned golden around the edges. The American party version differed from other dishes that shared the same name in Britain and elsewhere. Here the blanket was usually a small piece of biscuit or crescent-style dough, and the pig was a miniature sausage or a short section of hot dog. The preparation could become a family assembly line. One person opened the refrigerated dough container, producing the sudden pop that made everyone nearby look up. Another separated the triangles or strips. Children rolled the sausages from the wide end toward the point, sometimes wrapping them neatly, and sometimes leaving one end almost uncovered. The pieces were arranged on a baking sheet with enough space to expand, although the last row often became crowded when the cook discovered there were more sausages than available pan. Fresh from the oven, the dough was soft inside and lightly crisp outside, while the sausage remained hot enough to punish anyone who ignored the cooling tray. Mustard, ketchup, or a sweet dipping sauce might be offered, but the food was complete enough to disappear without assistance. Pigs in a blanket belonged naturally at children's birthdays, family game nights, holiday buffets, and neighborhood gatherings, because they were familiar in both flavor and shape. They could be eaten without a knife or fork carried across a room and recognized before anyone explained what they were. Their small size also created a convenient illusion. Eating one seemed harmless. Eating 6 happened through a series of unrelated decisions. A host could refill the platter in batches, bringing out another hot tray just as the first one emptied. Guests interpreted this as generosity, while the cook understood that each batch contained little more than dough sausage. And careful timing. Both foods demonstrated how 1970s entertaining often converted ordinary grocery products into party dishes through scale and presentation. A full-size hot dog on a bun belonged to lunch. A miniature sausage in pastry belonged on a silver-coloured tray beside cocktail napkins. Meatballs in tomato sauce could be dinner, but meatballs shining beneath grape jelly glaze became appetizers. The transformation required no rare ingredient. It required small portions, a serving vessel, and the suggestion that guests were participating in something special. That made these dishes accessible to hosts who wanted the table to look abundant without buying expensive cuts of meat or preparing several complicated recipes. The slow cooker and refrigerated dough also reduced last-minute work. One dish remained warm by itself. The other could be assembled earlier and baked shortly before the doorbell rang. The host still cleaned the kitchen, counted chairs, chilled drinks, and checked the bathroom towels, but at least the meatballs did not require supervision. These foods also reveal the confidence of packaged cooking during the decade. Refrigerated dough opened with a dramatic pop and promised reliable layers. Frozen meatballs removed mixing, shaping, and browning from the party schedule. Bottled sauce and grape jelly supplied a glaze whose flavor seemed far removed from the jars that created it. Products were not hidden because their use was embarrassing. For many cooks, they represented efficiency, consistency, and modern household skill. Knowing which packages could be combined was itself a form of practical knowledge. Community cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards preserved such combinations because they worked, travelled well, and invited variation. A relative might be known for adding extra mustard to the meatballs. Another browned the pastry with an egg wash, or sprinkled seeds over the dough. The basic recipes remained recognisable, but each family adjusted them just enough to claim ownership. Grape jelly meatballs and pigs in a blanket never completely left American parties. They still appear at holiday tables, football gatherings, potlucks, and family celebrations, sometimes with updated sauces or more elaborate dough. What faded was the novelty of seeing them as evidence of a modern new style of entertaining. Slow cookers are now ordinary kitchen equipment, refrigerated dough has countless uses, and appetizer tables borrow flavours from a far wider world. Yet the older versions still trigger the same physical memories: the mist beneath the slow cooker, lid the sweet red glaze on a toothpick, the pop of a cardboard dough tube, and a hot sausage disappearing beneath a spiral of pastry. These were foods built for movement, conversation, and repeated trips to the buffet. At the next gathering, however, the guests would finally need crackers and small plates. A cheese ball waited at the centre of the table, while rows of devilled eggs sat in a tray designed to keep every slippery half in its proper place. The cheese ball arrived on the party table looking less like a snack than a small upholstered centrepiece. It might be round oval or shaped into a log with a surface rolled in chopped pecans, parsley, paprika, or finely shredded cheese. Beneath that coating was a dense mixture of cream cheese, grated cheddar seasonings, and sometimes a small amount of onion Worcestershire sauce or chopped dried beef. In many 1970s homes, the cheese ball was prepared hours before the guests arrived so it could firm inside the refrigerator beneath wax paper or plastic wrap. When the covering came away, the cook transferred it to a decorative plate and arranged crackers around the edge in overlapping rows. The finished display looked abundant, symmetrical, and ready for company. It also presented the first guest with the social problem. Someone had to make the opening cut. Until that happened, everyone admired the smooth surface and reached for safer foods nearby, unwilling to be the person who damaged the centerpiece. Once a cracker finally pressed into the cheese, the entire table relaxed. Guests scraped away small portions, trying to collect enough spread without breaking the cracker or removing half the nut coating at once. Thin crackers snapped under pressure. Heavier ones survived but could carry more cheese than anyone intended. A small spreading knife sometimes rested beside the plate, although it gradually disappeared beneath the mixture and collected crumbs along its handle. The cheese ball changed shape throughout the evening. It began as a careful sphere and ended as an uneven mound with channels cut into every side. That slow dismantling was part of its appeal. Unlike individual appetizers, it encouraged guests to return to the same spot, stand close together, and continue a conversation while selecting another cracker. The dish needed no reheating, no complicated service, and no last-minute attention. It simply remained on the table, growing less formal with every bite. The ingredients could be adjusted according to budget and family taste. Some cheese balls were mild enough for children, built mainly from cream cheese and cheddar. Others contained blue cheese, garlic, horseradish, olives, green onions, or stronger seasonings intended for adults. Nuts gave the outside texture and helped the soft mixture retain its shape, but households avoiding them could use herbs, bacon pieces, or grated cheese instead. Packaged cream cheese made the base predictable, while recipes from magazines, community cookbooks, and food company booklets encouraged hosts to personalize the mixture. A cheese ball could be prepared from affordable ingredients, yet still appear suitable for a holiday gathering, bridge club, open house, or neighborhood party. It demonstrated a useful rule of entertaining. If ordinary food was shaped carefully and placed on the correct plate, it could acquire social importance. cubes of cheese belonged in a lunchbox, the same cheese blended. Chilled, coated, and surrounded by crackers had become an occasion. A few inches away, deviled eggs occupied a tray with shallow oval hollows designed for one purpose. The eggs had been boiled, cooled, peeled, and sliced lengthwise before the yolks were removed and mashed in a bowl. Mayonnaise, mustard, salt, pepper, pickle, relish, vinegar, or paprika could enter the filling depending on the family recipe. Some cooks used a spoon to return the mixture to the whites. Others filled a pastry bag or improvised one from wax paper, creating decorative ridges that made the eggs look more formal than their ingredients suggested. A final dusting of paprika supplied colour, although the shaking required restraint. Too little disappeared. Too much left one egg looking as though it had received entirely different instructions from the others. Arranged in rows, the finished halves looked neat, bright, and ready to travel at least until the tray met the first turn in the road. Transportation was the hidden challenge of deviled eggs. The whites were smooth, curved, and eager to slide across any flat plate. Specialized trays helped, but many families used an ordinary platter covered with wax paper lettuce leaves or a folded kitchen towel beneath the serving dish. Plastic wrap had to be stretched above the filling, rather than pressed directly against it. At picnics, church suppers, reunions, and holiday meals, the eggs also needed to remain cool, especially in warm weather. A careful cook carried them in an insulated container, or placed the tray back in the refrigerator until the last possible moment. Once served, they disappeared quickly. Guests rarely took only half an egg. They took two halves, which sounded like one egg and therefore seemed modest. A platter of 24 halves could vanish before the main meal began, leaving behind a few streaks of filling and one lonely egg that everyone politely avoided until someone finally asked whether anybody wanted the last one. Deviled eggs carried stronger family loyalties than their simple appearance suggested. One household expected sweet pickle relish. Another considered it unacceptable. Some fillings were sharply mustard-flavoured, while others were soft, creamy, and slightly sweet. A relative might add chopped pickles, celery hot sauce, or a small piece of olive on top. Children sometimes ate the filling first and left the empty whites on the plate, creating evidence that was difficult to explain. Adults compared the eggs silently with the version they knew at home. Because the dish appeared at so many gatherings, it became associated less with one decade than with recurring family occasions, but it fit naturally into the 1970s potluck and party table. Eggs were familiar and economical, the filling could be made ahead, and the tray looked generous without requiring expensive ingredients. The work was repetitive rather than difficult. Peel, slice, remove, mash, fill, garnish, and hope the whites remained intact. The cheese ball and deviled egg shared the same quiet transformation. Both began with everyday refrigerator foods and became company dishes through shaping, chilling, and careful arrangement. Neither depended on an exotic ingredient or a complicated cooking method. Their importance came from presentation and from the labour hidden behind the finished tray. Someone had peeled every egg without tearing the whites. Someone had chopped the nuts, softened the cheese, found the serving plate, and counted enough crackers for the room. These foods have never entirely disappeared, but they now compete with prepared appetizer trays, dips, restaurant catering, and a much broader range of party foods. Their older forms remain powerful because they recall a table built by hand, one cracker and one egg half at a time. Beyond that table waited a larger glass bowl, and through its clear sides guests could already see lettuce, peas, eggs, bacon, cheese, and dressing stacked in layers that were not supposed to mix until the serving spoon finally reached the bottom. The glass bowl mattered almost as much as the salad. A metal pan could hold the ingredients, but only a clear-sided bowl allowed everyone to see the construction chopped lettuce, packed at the bottom, a band of green peas, slices of hard-boiled egg, crumbled bacon, shredded cheese, and a thick, pale layer of dressing spread across the top like icing. In many 1970s kitchen 7-layer salad was not tossed before it reached the table. Its appeal depended on order colour, and the promise that every stripe would remain visible until the serving spoon finally cut through them. The cook stood at a formica counter arranging each ingredient with unusual care, wiping stray pieces of cheese from the inside of the bowl so the layers looked clean. A salad had become a display case. It was fresh food presented with the seriousness usually reserved for dessert. The exact 7 layers were never as fixed as the name suggested. Lettuce, peas, eggs, bacon, cheese, onion, and dressing formed one familiar arrangement, but tomatoes, celery, cauliflower, green pepper, or another vegetable could replace one of them. Some cooks counted the dressing as a layer. Others counted each ingredient beneath it and treated the topping as a protective roof. The order also shifted from one recipe card to another. What remained constant was the contrast between the crisp vegetables below and the smooth sealed surface above. The dressing was commonly built from mayonnaise, sometimes sweetened with a little sugar and sharpened with vinegar or another seasoning. It was spread from edge to edge so that as little air as possible reached the lettuce. Covered with plastic wrap and placed in the refrigerator, the bowl could wait for several hours or overnight, making it valuable to anyone preparing a meal before guests arrived. That waiting time was part of the dish's practical design. A tossed green salad demanded attention near serving time because dressing quickly softened the leaves. 7-layer salad was expected to sit. The ingredients were assembled in advance, the refrigerator did the holding, and the cook could move on to the meat rolls dessert table setting, or the dozen other details involved in feeding a room. At a church supper, family reunion, holiday meal, or neighbourhood potluck, the bowl arrived already complete. It required no outlet, no oven space, and no last-minute stirring. A layer of bacon and cheese gave it enough richness to compete with casseroles and baked beans, while the lettuce and peas allowed everyone to call it salad without becoming trapped in a technical discussion. It was vegetables dressed for company, although the dressing was thick enough to conceal several of them completely. The peas were often the most visually distinctive part. Bright green and nearly uniform, they formed a clear stripe against the lettuce and pale eggs. Frozen peas could be thawed and added without cooking them into softness, preserving enough firmness to survive beneath the upper layers. Their cold sweetness contrasted with salty bacon, sharp onion, creamy dressing, and shredded cheddar. That combination made the salad more substantial than a bowl of lettuce with bottled dressing. A serving contained crisp edges, soft small bursts of peas, cheese strands, and occasional pieces of bacon provided the spoon had travelled through the entire bowl. This was not always guaranteed. The first person serving faced a difficult task: push the utensil straight down through every layer, reach the bottom without tipping the bowl, and lift a portion that contained something from each level. A shallow scoop produced mostly dressing and cheese. A cautious scoop returned with lettuce and very little evidence of the work above it. As the meal continued, the perfect stripes began to collapse. The serving spoon carved a vertical opening through the side and the ingredients slowly slid into the empty space. Dressing spread downward, peas rolled into the lettuce, and bacon pieces migrated wherever the spoon carried them. By the second round, the salad looked less like an exhibit and more like an ordinary mixed dish. That transformation was expected, but it gave the first serving a ceremonial quality. Guests could admire the layers before anyone disturbed them, much as they might inspect a decorated cake before the knife entered. Children often selected the visible ingredients they trusted and avoided the onion. Adults attempted to create balanced portions while quietly collecting extra bacon. Someone eventually scraped dressing from the upper edge of the bowl, leaving a clear streak through which the remaining layers could be studied like sediment beneath glass. The name also helped 7-layer salad travel through community cookbooks and family recipe boxes. It was easy to remember, easy to describe, and flexible enough to accommodate household preferences. A recipe could specify 7 exact components, but the cook understood that substitution was allowed when the refrigerator suggested a different plan. Leftover boiled eggs could be used. Bacon from breakfast could return in smaller pieces. A partial bag of frozen peas gained a purpose, and a block of cheddar became the bright orange layer that completed the view. This salad therefore balanced presentation with economy. It looked deliberate even when several ingredients had been chosen because they were already available. Like many successful potluck foods, it could absorb improvisation without losing its identity. As long as the bowl displayed a convincing series of stripes beneath a creamy top, the name remained valid. 7-layer salad has never disappeared completely. Versions still appear at picnics, holiday meals, family gatherings, and restaurants that preserve older salad bar traditions. What changed was its position as a fashionable make-ahead centerpiece. Lighter dressings, more varied fresh produce, prepared supermarket salads, and changing ideas about mayonnaise-heavy dishes moved it away from the center of many tables. The rise of casual entertaining also reduced the need for a salad designed to be admired through glass before it was eaten. Yet the memory remains precise. The heavy bowl lifted from the refrigerator, the plastic wrap pulled away from the smooth white surface, the cold smell of lettuce and onion, and the first spoon cutting through 7 carefully protected bands. The dish made planning visible. Every layer showed that someone had prepared tomorrow's meal today. In the next refrigerator, the colours would become even less natural and considerably sweeter. A pale green Watergate salad waited beside a bowl of ambrosia, where marshmallows, canned fruit, coconut, and whipped topping had quietly erased the boundary between side dish and dessert. The pale green bowl usually arrived beneath plastic wrap, its surface uneven with miniature marshmallows, crushed pineapple, chopped nuts, and small pockets of whipped topping. In many mid-1970s kitchens, Watergate salad required no stove, no oven, and almost no equipment beyond a mixing bowl, a can opener, and a spoon. Dry pistachio-flavoured instant pudding mix was stirred directly into canned crushed pineapple with its juice, turning the liquid creamy and giving the mixture its unmistakable green colour. Whipped topping softened the pudding. Marshmallows added small white cushions, and nuts supplied the crunch that the other ingredients had largely declined to provide. The bowl then went into the refrigerator where the mixture thickened while the cook worked on the rest of the meal. It was called a salad, but it could stand beside the desserts without attracting suspicion. The 1970s table was generous about such categories. If a chilled dish contained fruit and arrived in a serving bowl, it could often claim salad status regardless of how much pudding and whipped topping had become involved. The recipe was initially known by Kraft as Pistachio Pineapple Delight, but the Watergate name attached itself to the dish during a decade when that single word seemed to spread across American culture. The precise path of the nickname remains uncertain, and later stories have supplied more confidence than evidence. What can be said safely is that the green mixture became strongly associated with the mid-1970s and with the newly available convenience of pistachio instant pudding. The name helped people remember it while the ingredients helped them reproduce it. There was no custard to cook and no cream to whip by hand, and no delicate technique to master. A cook opened packages, folded the mixture together, and let the refrigerator complete the transformation. At a potluck, the bowl attracted attention before anyone tasted it. The colour was somewhere between mint avocado and the inside of a kitchen appliance showroom. A spoonful looked fluffy sweet, and slightly mysterious, particularly when a marshmallow appeared beside a piece of pineapple and a green-tinted nut. Watergate salads suited church suppers, holiday meals, family reunions, and neighbourhood gatherings because it travelled easily and could be made in advance. The plastic wrap protected the top during the car ride, although a sharp turn could still push the entire mixture toward one side of the bowl. Once placed on the buffet, it remained cold, soft, and ready to serve without occupying valuable oven space. Children often approached it as dessert, whatever the adults called it. The marshmallows and whipped topping made the dish immediately understandable, while the pistachio flavour was mild enough not to interrupt the sweetness. Adults might place a small scoop beside ham green bean casserole and dinner rolls, creating a plate on which gravy and pale green pudding were separated by very little territory. The dish could seem festive because its colour was unusual, economical because canned fruit and packaged mixes stretched into many servings, and modern because almost every ingredient had been engineered for consistency. The only serious challenge was folding the whipped topping gently enough to keep the mixture light a standard that became less urgent once the marshmallows entered. Ambrosia occupied the neighbouring bowl, although its history reached much farther back than the 1970s. Earlier American versions were built from oranges, coconut and sugar, particularly in the South, where citrus and coconut once carried an air of special occasion abundance. Over time, canned pineapple, mandarin oranges, maraschino cherries, miniature marshmallows, sour cream mayonnaise, or whipped topping entered different family recipes. By the 1970s, ambrosia could range from a simple arrangement of fruit and coconut to a creamy mixture almost indistinguishable from dessert salad. No single bowl represented the correct national version. One family expected bright orange segments and cherries. Another rejected cherries but insisted on pecans. Some used sour cream to balance the sweetness, while others chose whipped topping and made no attempt to balance anything. The ingredients were folded together covered, and chilled until the coconut softened and the marshmallows absorbed enough moisture to lose their factory-fresh firmness. The opening of the cans created the familiar preparation sequence. Mandarin orange segments slid into a colander fragile enough to break beneath an impatient spoon. Pineapple drained beside them, while sweet syrup clung to the sink. A bag of coconut opened with a dry sugary smell, and marshmallows rolled across the counter whenever the pour became too enthusiastic. If maraschino cherries were included, they had to be drained carefully, or their red syrup would streak the entire bowl pink. The finished ambrosia was colourful, soft and rich with bursts of citrus hidden beneath cream and coconut. It appeared at Christmas dinners, Easter lunches, funeral meals, reunions and Sunday tables, especially in families where the recipe had been inherited rather than discovered on a package. A relative might bring the same bowl every year and receive gentle complaints if one ingredient changed. Ambrosia was flexible in theory, but often rigid in memory. People accepted many versions across the country, while remaining certain that their own family's version was the one the name truly described. Both salads reduced preparation time, but neither should be dismissed as merely lazy cooking. They answered the practical needs of crowded holiday kitchens and community meals. They could be assembled early, carried without reheating, served to many people, and made from ingredients that were available throughout the year. Canned fruit brought bright colour to winter tables. Packaged pudding and whipped topping produced predictable results for cooks, balancing several dishes at once. These foods also belong to a period when sweetness moved freely across the dinner plate. A creamy fruit salad could sit beside meat and vegetables, then remain in place while pie arrived. The boundary between accompaniment and dessert was not absent. It was simply negotiable. That flexibility now feels unusual because modern menus tend to sort sweet and savoury foods more strictly. But at many 1970s gatherings the plate was allowed to contain several arguments at once. Watergate salad and ambrosia have not vanished. Both remain part of family traditions, regional tables, retro-themed menus and online recipe collections. What declined was the era when a large bowl of whipped topping marshmallows and canned fruit could appear at nearly any gathering and require no explanation. Fresh fruit became available in greater variety, tastes changed, and creamy dessert salads began to carry an old-fashioned reputation. Yet the memory of them remains vivid. Plastic wrap stretched over a chilled bowl coconut caught on the serving spoon, a cherry staining the cream, and that unmistakable green mixture waiting beside the casseroles. These dishes turned packages and cans into something associated with relatives' holidays and tables crowded with food. In the next refrigerator, however, sweetness would meet vegetables in a far more structured form. A decorative mould was waiting to release a trembling ring of gelatin, with ingredients suspended inside as though the entire salad had been asked to hold perfectly still. The mould waited upside down on a serving plate while someone held a warm towel against its metal or glass surface and hoped the gelatin would release in one piece. In many 1970s kitchens, a moulded salad was judged before anyone tasted it. The ring had to stand upright, its ridges clear, its surface glossy, and its suspended ingredients distributed well enough to suggest planning rather than accident. Inside might be shredded carrots, chopped celery, cucumber, cabbage, olives, canned pineapple, cottage cheese, or small pieces of seafood depending on the recipe and the courage of the household. When the mould finally slipped free, it landed with a soft movement that was more felt than heard. The entire creation trembled beneath the ceiling light, carrying vegetables in positions they would never have chosen for themselves. A lettuce leaf might be tucked beneath the ring mayonnaise placed in the centre, and paprika added at the last moment. Salad had become architecture. Gelatin dishes had been fashionable long before the 1970s, and earlier generations had used labour-intensive natural gelatin or commercial powdered products to create elaborate presentations. By the post-war decades, packaged gelatin, dependable refrigeration canned ingredients, and company recipe booklets had made moulded salads easier for ordinary households to attempt. The 1970s inherited that confidence. A cold, perfectly shaped dish suggested modern control over ingredients' temperature and time. It could be prepared hours before a luncheon, holiday meal, bridal shower, or church gathering, leaving the cook free to handle hot food later. The refrigerator performed the final work in silence. A bowl of liquid became firm enough to slice, and ordinary vegetables emerged from the cold, looking strangely ceremonial. The result fit naturally beside patterned glassware, divided serving dishes and tables, where presentation carried nearly as much importance as flavour. Preparation required more judgment than the finished ring admitted. The gelatin powder had to dissolve fully in hot liquid before cold ingredients were added. If vegetables or fruit entered too soon, they sank to the bottom. If the mixture chilled too far before the additions were folded in, they remained trapped near the top in a crowded band. A careful cook watched for the stage when the liquid thickened slightly, then stirred in the solid ingredients so they would remain suspended. Some recipes used lemon or lime gelatin as the base. Others relied on unflavoured gelatin combined with tomato juice, broth, vinegar, or seasoned vegetable liquid. The colour could range from transparent gold to pale green, bright red, or a shade of orange that matched the kitchen curtains. The mould itself might be a simple ring, a fluted copper form displayed on the wall between uses, or a decorative shape with so many grooves that washing it afterward became a private argument against ever making the recipe again. Savoury gelatin salads occupied an uncertain territory between freshness and preservation. Celery remained recognisable but lost some of its crispness. Cottage cheese formed white clouds inside green gelatin. Grated carrots created orange threads that appeared to float in place. Cabbage, olives, pickles, and canned vegetables could all become part of the design, held together by a substance usually associated with dessert. For diners accustomed to these salads, the texture could be cool, refreshing and pleasantly tart, especially when served with mayonnaise or a creamy dressing. For children encountering one without preparation, the experience could be more complicated. The gelatin promised sweetness by appearance, but the first bite might deliver celery vinegar or tuna. This was not deception in the formal sense, yet the bright colour had clearly created expectations the recipe had no intention of meeting. A child learned to inspect the suspended objects before allowing the serving spoon near the plate. The most ambitious moulds sometimes included shrimp, crab, tuna, or other seafood, often combined with cream cheese mayonnaise seasonings and finely chopped vegetables. These dishes appeared in magazine spreads and party menus because they could be sliced neatly and decorated with cucumber, lemon, or parsley. They also demanded responsible handling. Seafood mixtures needed to remain properly chilled, and a long afternoon on a warm buffet table was never their ideal setting. Even without seafood, the mould faced ordinary transportation dangers. A sudden stop in the car could shift it across the platter. Heat softened the edges. Plastic wrap pressed too closely against the surface left marks that ruined the glassy finish. The cook who successfully delivered a complete gelatin ring to a church basement or family reunion had accomplished more than the guests might understand. They saw a trembling salad. The cook remembered the unmoulding, the carrying, and every turn in the road. These dishes flourished partly because they turned inexpensive ingredients into something visually abundant. A small quantity of vegetables, canned fruit, cottage cheese, or seafood could be spread through an entire ring of gelatin, creating many slices from modest amounts. The shape also made leftovers and pantry ingredients appear intentional. Half a cucumber, several olives, or a small amount of grated carrot no longer looked insufficient once suspended throughout a decorative mould. Food companies encouraged this kind of creativity through package recipes and promotional booklets, presenting gelatin as a flexible ingredient capable of producing salads, main dishes, desserts, and party centerpieces. The advertisements often displayed flawless moulds with ingredients arranged as evenly as jewels. Home versions were more human. One side might contain most of the carrots. An olive could rest against the surface in a position impossible to ignore. The ring might split during release and require lettuce leaves to conceal the damage. Garnish was sometimes less decoration than structural repair. By the end of the 1970s and into later decades, savory gelatin moulds began to lose their authority at the American table. Tastes shifted towards salads that looked fresher and required less explanation. Supermarkets offered wider selections of produce throughout the year, and hosts increasingly preferred raw vegetables, tossed salads, dips, and dishes inspired by a broader range of cuisines. Gelatin remained popular in desserts, but combining it with vegetables, mayonnaise, or seafood came to seem old-fashioned to many families. The decline was not absolute. Moulded salads continued in regional traditions, holiday menus, community cookbooks, and households where one particular recipe belonged to a beloved relative. What disappeared was the assumption that a trembling ring represented progress. Today it often appears as a symbol of retro cooking, sometimes mocked, without remembering the practical reasons behind it. Yet behind every mould stood refrigeration, advanced planning, careful timing, and a cook trying to make modest ingredients look worthy of company. When the last slice was lifted from the platter, the table returned to warmer, heavier comforts. A casserole dish waited nearby with green beans, mushroom sauce, and fried onions, while another pan used potatoes and leftover ham to make one holiday meal last a little longer. The green bean casserole entered the holiday kitchen in separate packages that hardly suggested celebration. Cans of cut green beans waited beside condensed mushroom soup, a splash of milk black pepper, and a container of crisp fried onions whose lid was often opened more than once before the dish reached the oven. In many 1970s homes, the ingredients were stirred together in a shallow casserole dish until the pale sauce coated every bean. Then part of the onion topping was folded inside while the rest remained reserved for the final minutes of baking. The casserole emerged bubbling around the edges, creamy beneath the surface, and crowned with onions that had darkened just enough to become crisp and fragrant. It did not require fresh produce, complicated seasoning, or much preparation space, all valuable qualities on a day when the oven already belonged to a turkey ham pies rolls and several relatives offering advice. Green bean casserole had been promoted before the 1970s, but during the decade it settled firmly into many Thanksgiving and Christmas routines, where a branded convenience recipe gradually became something families spoke of as tradition. Its appeal depended on more than convenience. The ingredients were dependable throughout the year, easy to store, and affordable enough to feed a crowded table. Canned green beans had already been washed, trimmed, cut, and cooked. Condensed soup supplied sauce without requiring butter, flour, broth, and patient stirring. Fried onions created the contrast that the soft beans and creamy mixture needed, provided they were not buried too early and allowed to surrender all their crispness. A cook could assemble the dish before guests arrived, cover it, and slide it into the oven when space became available. The exact recipe varied. Some families added soy sauce, grated cheese, sliced mushrooms, bacon, water chestnuts, or extra onions. Others considered any alteration unnecessary and possibly suspicious. The casserole became one of those holiday foods people claimed not to care about until it was missing. Children might avoid the beans while collecting the topping. Adults could take a polite spoonful and return for another once the serving dish had moved farther down the table. Its familiarity was part of the flavor. The casserole also demonstrated how packaged food companies shaped American home cooking without entirely controlling it. A recipe printed on a label or promoted in a magazine could enter thousands of kitchens, but once it arrived, families adjusted it, repeated it, and connected it to their own gatherings. After enough holidays, the original advertisement mattered less than the relative who always prepared the dish. The sound of the fried onion container opening, the sight of the familiar baking pan, and the smell of mushroom sauce warming beside the turkey became personal memory rather than corporate instruction. That transformation helps explain why green bean casserole endured while many other promotional recipes disappeared. It solved a real problem, used ingredients people could find, and occupied a clear place on the plate between meat, potatoes, and rolls. It was neither elegant nor especially colourful, but holiday tables rarely demanded that every dish compete for beauty. Some foods existed to announce abundance. This one existed to prove that the side dish section had been properly completed. A few days later, another casserole dish answered a different household question: what should happen to the remaining ham? The holiday centerpiece had already appeared in thick slices beside rolls, vegetables, and perhaps a pineapple garnish. Now the bone-uneven end pieces and smaller scraps remained inside the refrigerator beneath foil. Scalloped potatoes with ham gave those leftovers a second life. Potatoes were peeled and cut into thin rounds, then layered in a buttered baking dish with chopped ham, onion, salt, pepper, and a white sauce made from milk thickened with flour and fat. In quicker versions, condensed soup might replace the homemade sauce. The layers were repeated until the dish was full, and milk or sauce disappeared into the spaces between the potatoes. Covered with foil, the casserole baked slowly while the potatoes softened and absorbed the smoky, salty flavour of the meat. Near the end, the cover came away so the surface could brown. The success of scalloped potatoes depended on slicing and patience. Thick potato rounds could remain firm long after the family expected dinner. Slices cut too thin might collapse into sauce before the top browned. A sharp knife box grater attachment or mechanical slicer could make the pieces more uniform, though many cooks simply work through a pile of potatoes by hand. Cheese appeared in some versions, especially when the dish moved toward what many households called potatoes, au gratin, but family terminology was rarely precise. A recipe might be called scalloped potatoes even when cheddar covered the top because that was the name written on the card, and no one at the table intended to hold a culinary hearing. The ham supplied enough flavour that only a modest amount was required. Small pink pieces appeared between pale potato layers, making the casserole feel meatier than the quantity of leftovers would have suggested. Served with peas, green beans, applesauce or bread, it became a complete supper built from what remained after a more expensive meal. This was household economy without the emotional weight of serving the same plate twice. Cold slices of ham could feel like leftovers. Ham baked between potatoes beneath a browned cream sauce felt like a new dinner. That distinction mattered in families where wasting usable food was unacceptable, but enthusiasm for repetition had limits. The casserole could feed several people, reheat well, and sometimes improve after a night in the refrigerator, when the sauce had thickened and the layers held together more firmly. It also made use of oven time rather than constant attention at the stove. Once assembled, the dish cooked while the household returned to work, school preparation, laundry, or the quiet recovery that followed a major holiday. The smell reached through the house, slowly, warm milk, onion, potato, and the unmistakable smokiness of ham. By the time the foil lifted, yesterday's centerpiece had become tonight's comfort food. Green bean casserole and scalloped potatoes with ham represented two sides of the same 1970s table. One turned canned ingredients and a branded recipe into a holiday tradition. The other turned holiday abundance into several more economical meals. Both depended on a baking dish, a warm oven, and the confidence that creaminess could bring unrelated ingredients together. Neither has vanished. Green bean casserole remains attached to holiday menus, while potatoes and ham continue to appear wherever leftovers need a respectable destination. What has changed is the automatic place these dishes once held in many family routines. Fresh vegetables, lighter preparations, restaurant meals, and changing household sizes have created more alternatives. Yet the old casseroles still carry the memory of a crowded refrigerator foil, folded over a serving dish, and someone calculating how many more dinners could be found inside one ham. After the last creamy spoonful, the next meal would become smaller, faster, and more individual. Beneath the broiler, English muffins waited for tomato sauce and cheese, ready to become pizzas before anyone could order the real thing. The English muffin split open along its rough middle, leaving two uneven circles filled with small holes ready to catch sauce. In many 1970s kitchens, that simple bread became the foundation for one of the quickest homemade versions of pizza. The halves were placed on a metal baking sheet spooned with jarred tomato sauce sprinkled with dried oregano or garlic salt, and covered with grated mozzarella, sliced American cheese, or whatever cheese the refrigerator could provide. Pepperoni might appear when a package was already open, but many versions stopped at sauce and cheese. The tray slid beneath the broiler where nothing seemed to happen for several seconds, and then everything happened at once. The cheese softened, bubbled, and browned at the edges while the exposed crust moved rapidly from toasted to endangered. A child sent to watch the oven was given an important responsibility, and very little time to understand it. English muffin pizzas occupied the useful space between a snack and a meal. One half could satisfy a child arriving home from school. 2 or 3 halves joined by carrot sticks, canned fruit, or a glass of milk could become supper on a busy evening. The ingredients were familiar, inexpensive, and easy to divide among several people. Each person could assemble an individual version without affecting anyone else's dinner. A child who disliked onions received none. Another could add mushrooms. Olives cooked sausage or an alarming amount of cheese. The family did not need to agree on one large pizza because every muffin half functioned as its own small territory. This felt modern and democratic, although the adult who purchased the ingredients and cleaned the baking sheet still controlled the government. The texture made the English muffin particularly suitable for the job. Its split surface held tomato sauce inside dozens of small pockets, reducing the chance that all the topping would slide away with the first bite. The outer edge became crisp beneath the broiler while the centre remained chewy. Cheese melted into the hollows and sometimes flowed over the side, welding the muffin temporarily to the pan. A spatula had to be worked underneath with care, especially if the cook had forgotten to grease the sheet or place foil beneath the pizzas. The first bite carried toasted bread, sweet tomato sauce, dried herbs and cheese, hot enough to stretch from mouth to plate. Like the frozen pot pie, the food appeared harmless while concealing a layer capable of burning the roof of the mouth. Children rarely waited. Experience provided the cooling instructions that the recipe had omitted. The meal also reflected how widely pizza had entered American family life by the 1970s. Restaurant and takeout pizza were increasingly familiar, but ordering one was still an occasional expense in many households rather than an automatic answer to every difficult evening. Homemade substitutes allowed the flavor idea to enter the kitchen using supermarket staples. English muffins were not the only base. Families also used hamburger buns, slices of white bread biscuit dough, French bread, or refrigerated rolls. The English muffin version endured because the bread was sturdy portioned and already shaped like a very small pizza. It required no dough mixing, rolling, rising, or argument with yeast. The cook opened a package and began with a crust that had completed all its major decisions before reaching the house. For children, assembly could be as important as eating. A jar of sauce, a bowl of shredded cheese, and several toppings turned the counter into a small production line. Spoonfuls were spread toward the edges, although too much sauce created a soggy center. Cheese was pinched between fingers and scattered across the top with a noticeable percentage landing on the baking sheet. Pepperoni slices were counted and arranged according to rules known only to the child placing them. One muffin might receive a smiling face made from olives. Another could carry so much topping that its surface disappeared completely. Allowing children to build their own pizzas gave them a visible role in dinner and increased the chance that they would eat what they had made. It also revealed that independence often required an adult to open the jar grate, the cheese, operate the broiler, and remove the tray before smoke appeared. Parents appreciated the pizzas for different reasons. They used leftovers without announcing them as leftovers. A small amount of cooked ground beef, several slices of ham, half a green pepper, or the end of a cheese block could be divided across the muffins and presented as choice rather than necessity. The pizzas also adapted to irregular schedules. A fresh tray could be prepared for one child after school, another after practice, and an adult arriving later from work. No large casserole had to remain warm, and no full meal had to be reheated repeatedly. The ingredients waited in the refrigerator ready to become dinner in small batches. This flexibility matched a decade in which family members were increasingly pulled towards separate school activities, work hours, clubs, errands, and evening obligations. The family table still mattered, but some nights it had to be assembled one muffin at a time. English muffin pizzas never truly disappeared. They remain a children's cooking project and after-school snack, and a reliable solution for households with bread sauce and cheese. What faded was the sense that they were a clever new imitation of restaurant food. Frozen pizzas, improved delivery, became easier, supermarket choices multiplied and prepared. Personal pizzas became ordinary. Still, the homemade muffin version retains a warmth that more polished substitutes cannot reproduce. The sauce was never spread evenly. The cheese browned differently on every half. One edge was usually darker than the others, and at least one topping rolled onto the oven floor. These imperfections made the food personal. It was pizza reduced to its simplest family logic. Use the bread already in the house, let everyone choose a topping, and keep one eye on the broiler. When the tray was empty, the kitchen smelled faintly of toasted cheese and tomato sauce, and the baking sheet carried small, hardened circles where the topping had escaped. The meal had been quick, individual, and almost playful, but the next forgotten food required even less cooking. It waited inside the refrigerator in a flat plastic package ready to be placed between two slices of soft white bread. Bologna American cheese mustard and wax paper would turn the lunchbox into another carefully packed part of the 1970s family day. The bologna slice came from a flat plastic package perfectly round and nearly the same width as the white bread waiting beside it. In many 1970s kitchens, a school or work lunch began on a formica counter, with two soft slices laid open, a knife spreading mayonnaise or yellow mustard toward the corners, and a square of American cheese placed over the pink meat. The geometry was never quite right. The bologna was round, the cheese was square, and the bread had rounded shoulders of its own, leaving every bite with a slightly different arrangement. Some families added lettuce pickle slices or another layer of meat. Others kept the sandwich plain because plain travelled better and attracted fewer objections. Once assembled, it was pressed gently together, cut into rectangles or triangles, and wrapped in wax paper, plastic film, or a small sandwich bag before being lowered into a metal or moulded plastic lunchbox. The sandwich belonged to a larger morning routine that often began before the child eating it was fully awake. A parent stood at the counter while coffee percolated, toast browned, and the radio carried weather or traffic reports from another room. Several lunches might be prepared at once, each with small differences that had to be remembered. One child wanted mustard but no cheese. Another accepted cheese only if it was placed beneath the meat. An adult lunch might receive extra bologna, onion, or a thicker layer of mayonnaise. The finished sandwiches were lined up beside apples, bananas, small bags of chips, cookies, and thermos bottles waiting to be filled. Packing lunch was repetitive work, but it required attention. A forgotten napkin, a leaking fruit cup, or a thermos lid that had not been tightened could reshape the entire afternoon. The bologna sandwich was popular partly because it reduced uncertainty. It was quick to assemble, easy to divide, and familiar enough to survive several hours away from home. Bologna itself occupied an unusual place in family food memory. It was inexpensive compared with many sliced meats mild enough for children, and sold in portions that could provide several lunches from one grocery purchase. The slices separated with a faint damp sound, sometimes clinging together until a fingernail found the edge. Their smooth surface and uniform shape made them look more manufactured than roast beef or leftover ham, but that consistency was part of their usefulness. Every slice fit the next. No carving was required, no bone remained, and no one had to decide which pieces were too fatty for a sandwich. American cheese offered the same predictability. Individually wrapped slices could be counted, stacked, and distributed without a knife. The wrappers accumulated on the counter during the morning rush, each one peeling away with a soft plastic sound before the cheese settled over the meat like a square yellow blanket. Soft white bread completed the texture. It compressed beneath the fingers, absorbed mayonnaise at the edges, and gradually changed during the hours inside the lunchbox. by noon the sandwich could be cool, slightly flattened, and carrying the mingled smell of bread, mustard, processed cheese, and whatever fruit had been packed beside it. Wax paper protected it, but did not create a perfect seal. A banana could lend its aroma to everything nearby. An apple rolled against the wrapped sandwich each time the lunchbox swung down a hallway. Potato chips packed in a small bag might arrive as fragments, while cookies remained mysteriously intact. The sandwich itself usually survived because there was very little inside it capable of escaping. Unlike a sloppy Joe or tuna salad sandwich, it respected the boundaries of the bread. This made it especially suitable for a child who had to eat quickly in a noisy cafeteria, or for a worker opening lunch beside a factory floor office desk construction site or parked truck. At school, the lunchbox became part of a child's public identity. Its exterior might display a cartoon television character sports image or bright design, but the food inside revealed the household more quietly. One student opened a bologna and cheese sandwich while another had peanut butter leftover chicken, a thermos of soup cafeteria money, or a meal shaped by a completely different regional or cultural tradition. Not every American child carried the same lunch, and many families relied on school meal programs or local foods that did not resemble the familiar suburban lunchbox image. Even among children holding nearly identical sandwiches, opinions varied. Some traded cookies but kept the bologna. Others removed the cheese, peeled away the crust, or exchanged the entire sandwich for something sweeter. A slice of bologna could be ordinary at home and embarrassing at a cafeteria table if another child had arrived with a more desirable snack. Childhood food memories often contain both comfort and comparison. Adults packed the same sandwich for practical reasons. It was affordable, portable, and required no reheating. A lunch made before sunrise could be eaten during a short break without utensils or a microwave equipment that many workplaces did not yet provide. The sandwich fit inside a brown paper bag with a piece of fruit and a thermos of coffee. For families watching the grocery budget, the package of bologna performed several duties: school lunches, work lunches, quick weekend sandwiches, and occasionally fried bologna at breakfast or supper. A slice placed in a hot skillet curled upward at the edges, unless someone cut small slits around it, forming a shallow cup that browned in the center. That transformation gave the meat another life when cold sandwiches became repetitive. Nothing in the package had to be wasted, and the final slices often appeared just before the next grocery trip, when choice narrowed and practicality became more visible. The bologna and American cheese sandwich did not disappear, but it lost some of the central place it once held in packed lunches. Supermarkets introduced wider varieties of sliced turkey chicken cheeses, wrapped snack packs, and prepared foods. School cafeterias changed, workplace refrigerators and microwaves became more common, and families gained more portable options. Concerns about food storage also made many households more careful about keeping meat and cheese cold throughout the day. Yet the sandwich remains one of the clearest objects in 1970s lunch memory, because it carried the home into another building. The smell of wax paper, the soft bread pressed into a lunchbox corner, the square cheese extending beyond the round bologna, and the small note occasionally tucked beside it, all belong to the same ordinary ritual. After lunch, the wrapper was folded, the crumbs were brushed away, and the empty box returned home. In the next kitchen, canned pineapple rings and bright red cherries waited above a layer of brown sugar ready for a cake that would reveal its decoration only after the most dangerous flip in the recipe. The pineapple rings went into the bottom of the pan before the cake batter ever appeared. In many 1970s kitchens, melted butter and brown sugar were spread across a round or rectangular baking pan, creating a glossy layer that smelled warm and caramel-like, even before it entered the oven. Canned pineapple rings were arranged carefully over the sugar, each one given enough room to remain visible after baking. Bright red maraschino cherries were placed in the centres, with extra cherries sometimes tucked into the spaces between the rings. The design looked finished, but it was still hidden beneath what came next. Yellow cake batter was poured slowly over the fruit, covering every ring and cherry, until the decoration disappeared completely. For the next half hour or more, the cake looked ordinary. Its entire performance depended on what happened after it left the oven. Pineapple upside-down cake had become popular decades before the 1970s, helped by the growing availability of canned pineapple and the appeal of desserts that looked elaborate without requiring professional decorating skills. By the 1970s, it remained familiar at family dinners, church suppers, bridge gatherings, birthday tables, and occasions when company deserved something more impressive than a plain sheet cake. The ingredients were easy to keep in the pantry: a can of pineapple, a jar of cherries, brown sugar, and a boxed cake mix, or the flour and sugar needed for a homemade batter. No frosting bag was required. No one had to create roses from buttercream or smooth icing around the sides. The pan performed the decorating while the cake baked. The cook arranged the fruit once trusted the oven and waited for the hidden pattern to reappear. It was efficient, colourful, and just dramatic enough to make guests believe the dessert had demanded more work than it usually had. The danger arrived when the cake was done. It could not remain in the pan until completely cool because the brown sugar topping would harden and glue itself to the metal. It also could not be turned out immediately when the cake was fragile and the bubbling syrup hot enough to burn a careless hand. The cook waited a few minutes, ran a knife around the edge, placed a serving plate upside down over the pan, and gripped both pieces firmly with oven mitts or folded towels. Then came the flip. For one brief second, the entire dessert was held between gravity and confidence. The pan turned over, the plate landed beneath it, and everyone nearby listened for the soft release of cake against china. If the cook had judged correctly, the cake slid free in one complete piece. If not, several pineapple rings remained attached to the pan, requiring immediate repair before anyone entered the kitchen. Repair was usually possible. A ring stuck to the metal could be lifted with a spatula and returned to the bare space it had left behind. A cherry could be repositioned. Loose pieces of brown sugar topping could be scraped from the pan and spread over the surface while still warm. The finished cake was forgiving because its decoration already looked homemade. The fruit did not need perfect symmetry, and the caramelized topping concealed small cracks. What mattered was the overall effect: golden cake beneath shiny pineapple red cherries glowing beneath the kitchen light, and brown syrup running slowly toward the edges. The dessert looked festive without frosting and tropical without requiring fresh fruit. It brought bright colour to winter holiday tables and a sense of occasion to ordinary Sundays. A cake made from supermarket cans could still produce a moment of ceremony when the pan finally lifted away. The first slice revealed how completely the topping had changed during baking. Pineapple juice, butter, and brown sugar had soaked into the upper surface of the cake, making it darker, denser, and sweeter than the crumb below. The pineapple rings softened but kept their shape, while the cherries became even brighter against the caramel glaze. A serving knife had to pass through both fruit and cake, and the round rings did not always cooperate with neat portions. One person might receive most of a pineapple slice, while the next received the narrow strip between two rings. Children often watch the cherry distribution carefully. A piece with a whole cherry seemed obviously superior, even if the cake itself was identical. Whipped cream or vanilla ice cream might be added, but the dessert was rich enough to stand alone. It tasted of warm, sugar, canned fruit butter, and soft yellow cake, a combination that was sweet moist, and unmistakably designed for company. The cake also carried the confidence of an era when canned fruit was not treated merely as a substitute for fresh produce. It was a dependable household ingredient with its own uses available in every season, and already peeled, sliced and preserved in juice or syrup. Pineapple rings were especially valuable because their shape created decoration automatically. The circular slices looked orderly, modern, and almost mechanical, fitting neatly into the visual style of recipe advertisements and company cookbooks. Maraschino cherries supplied a red center that nature had not provided but the dessert clearly appreciated. Some versions added pecans between the rings. Others used crushed pineapple, peach halves, or different fruit arrangements, but the ring and cherry pattern became the image many families remembered. It appeared on recipe cards with stained corners and in baking pans whose scratches recorded years of similar flips. Pineapple upside-down cake gradually lost some of its central place as dessert fashions changed. Bakeries offered more elaborate cakes, fresh fruit desserts became easier to prepare year-round, and home cooks discovered countless shortcuts that did not involve turning a hot pan over a serving plate. The cake also became associated with an older style of entertaining, along with gelatin molds, cheese balls, and fruit salads made with whipped topping. Yet it never disappeared. It continues to appear wherever families value the combination of pantry convenience, strong visual memory, and a small moment of kitchen suspense. Few desserts make their final appearance so suddenly. One moment the decoration is hidden beneath a metal pan. The next pineapple and cherries are shining in full view, and the cook is pretending there was never any doubt. When the last sticky crumbs were lifted from the plate, another cake waited in the pantry, but this one rejected careful arrangement almost completely. Canned fruit would be emptied into a baking dish, dry cake mix scattered over the top, and butter placed across the surface without conventional stirring. The name was not elegant, the method looked unfinished, and the result became one of the decade's most memorable convenience desserts. The recipe began with an instruction that seemed almost irresponsible: do not mix. In many 1970s, kitchens dump cake started when canned fruit was emptied into a rectangular baking dish and spread across the bottom with its syrup or juice still included. Crushed pineapple might form the first layer, followed by cherry pie filling peaches, or another canned fruit chosen from the pantry shelf. Then a dry box of yellow or white cake mix was scattered directly over the surface. No eggs were cracked into a bowl, no batter was beaten, no measuring cup of milk appeared beside the mixer. Slices or small pieces of butter were placed across the dry powder, sometimes in careful rows, and sometimes with the confidence that the oven would eventually understand the arrangement. Chopped nuts might be added on top. The dish then went into the heat looking unfinished, dusty, and unlike any cake a cautious baker had been taught to trust. That refusal to stir was the entire trick. As the fruit bubbled beneath the cake mix, its moisture rose into the dry powder, while the melting butter travelled downward. Some areas became golden and crisp. Others remained soft where fruit juice soaked through. The top developed irregular ridges, buttery patches, and small islands of dry mix that revealed whether the pieces of butter had been distributed generously enough. A cook opening the oven door near the end might notice one pale corner and add another piece of butter, a practical correction rarely mentioned in the clean recipe printed on a card. The kitchen filled with the smell of warm fruit, sugar, and toasted cake mix, closer to a cobbler than a traditional layer cake. There was no smooth surface, no frosting, and no possibility of cutting perfectly even slices. Dump cake was served with a large spoon because it had abandoned the architectural responsibilities normally expected of cake. The name was direct, memorable, and not especially flattering. It described the method rather than the finished dessert: dump the fruit into the pan, dump the mix over it, add butter, and bake. Versions circulated through newspapers, community cookbooks, company recipe collections, church groups, and handwritten cards during the 1970s. Although the basic idea of combining fruit with an easy topping had older relatives in American home cooking, the decade gave the method an especially suitable environment. Cake mixes were already familiar pantry staples. Canned fruit was available throughout the year, and convenience recipes were celebrated for reducing steps rather than concealing that they did so. A dessert that eliminated bowls, beaters, and precise mixing fit naturally into kitchens where dinner preparation competed with paid work, school schedules, laundry errands, and family obligations. The recipe did not promise elegance. It promised that something hot and sweet could be ready with very little preparation and only one main baking dish to wash. Dump cake also performed well when the pantry contained more ingredients than the cook's attention could organize. A can of crushed pineapple, a package of cake mix, and a stick of butter did not appear to belong to the same recipe until they were placed in layers. Cherry pie filling added color and sweetness. Peaches produced a softer, more familiar cobbler-like result. Pecans or walnuts created a crisp topping and made the dessert seem more complete when company was expected. Some families added coconut. Others used spice cake mix, chocolate mix, or a combination remembered from a relative's recipe card. These variations did not require advanced technique because the method remained forgiving. The fruit could be uneven. The butter pieces could vary in size. The cake mix did not need to be leveled with mathematical accuracy. The oven corrected much of the disorder, and vanilla ice cream corrected nearly everything else. The first spoonful revealed several textures at once. The upper crust could be crisp and buttery, especially near the edges where the pan concentrated the heat. Beneath it, softened cake mix absorbed fruit syrup and became dense, sweet, and almost pudding-like. Cherries or peach slices remained hot enough to demand caution, while pineapple fibers gave the filling a slight chew. Served warm, the dessert collapsed into the bowl rather than holding a formal slice. A scoop of vanilla ice cream began melting immediately, sending white streams through the fruit and crumbs. Whipped topping offered a colder, lighter alternative and required no waiting for the dessert to cool. Children rarely objected to the appearance once ice cream was added. Adults who had watched the unpromising dry mix enter the oven could regard the transformation with genuine respect. It was not a delicate cake, but it had produced dessert without asking anyone to cream butter, sift flour, or wash mixing beaters. The method carried its own small risks. Too little butter left dry powder on the surface, creating pale patches that looked exactly as unfinished as they tasted. Too much liquid from the fruit could make the center heavy and soft. A thin layer of cake mix baked more evenly, while a thick mound could protect itself from both butter and juice. The cook therefore learned to scatter rather than pour, distribute rather than stir, and trust the ingredients only after giving them a reasonable chance to meet. This was convenience cooking, but it still depended on judgment. The recipe removed formal technique while preserving household experience. Someone had to know which fruit combinations worked, how closely the butter should be spaced, and when the bubbling edges meant the center was ready. Packaged ingredients simplified the process, yet the cook still turned them into a family dessert through timing adaptation and the decision to ignore the alarming appearance of the unbaked pan. Dump cake became useful far beyond an ordinary weeknight. It could feed a crowd at a potluck, provide a hot dessert at a family reunion, or use pantry ingredients when unexpected guests appeared. The baking dish travelled easily beneath foil, and the dessert did not suffer from a rough car ride because it had never depended on perfect shape. At church suppers and neighbourhood gatherings it sat comfortably beside brownies, sheet cakes, fruit pies, and bowls of whipped desserts. People could take a spoonful as small or generous as they wished, although the crisp corners often disappeared first. The recipe also invited children to help because pouring canned fruit and scattering mix required little precision. An adult handled the can opener, the hot oven, and the butter knife, but a child could participate in the visible construction and later announced that the cake had been made personally. This claim was both true and carefully incomplete. Dump cake never vanished, but it gradually lost the novelty that once made its method feel almost magical. Supermarket bakeries expanded, frozen desserts multiplied, and countless newer recipes promised convenience with different ingredients and appliances. The name also placed it firmly in the category of informal home cooking, rather than polished entertaining. Yet the dessert remains memorable because it captured the decade's faith in the boxed mix and the practical imagination of household cooks. It showed that following instructions did not always mean stirring, beating, or decorating. Sometimes the correct technique was to leave the ingredients alone and allow heat to create order from an untidy pan. When the last warm spoonful had been served, the pantry looked a little emptier, and the cardboard box lay folded in the trash. But the larger story of the 1970s kitchen was not finished. Recipe cards and family habits were increasingly sharing space with boxes, freezer packages, slow cookers, and new appliances, each one promising to change how dinner reached the table. The handwritten recipe card did not disappear when the cardboard box arrived. It remained inside a small wooden file stained with vanilla tomato sauce, or the grease from someone's thumb, while packages with printed instructions gathered around it in the pantry. In many 1970s kitchens, dinner was built from both kinds of knowledge. A cook might follow a relative's instructions for scalloped potatoes, then open condensed soup for the sauce. A homemade meatloaf could be served beside instant mashed potatoes. A cake recipe copied in blue ink might begin with a boxed mix because that was how the family had always made it. Convenience did not sweep through the kitchen in one dramatic moment and replace everything that came before. It entered ingredient by ingredient, promising fewer measurements, fewer decisions, and more predictable results. The recipe card still carried family memory. The package supplied reassurance. Together they created a table that was increasingly homemade with assistance. That assistance became especially valuable as grocery prices rose and household budgets faced repeated pressure during the decade. The sharp inflation of the 1970s was not an abstract economic discussion. When someone stood beneath supermarket lights, comparing meat prices, counting cans in a cart, and deciding whether the family could wait another week for coffee butter or a favourite snack. Ground beef was stretched with noodles, rice bean sauce and boxed seasonings. Leftover ham entered potato casseroles. Chicken pieces rested over rice rather than appearing as individual portions beside it. Coupons were clipped from newspapers, store advertisements were checked before the shopping trip, and less expensive brands gained attention when familiar labels cost more than the budget allowed. Packaged meals sometimes saved money, although not always. Their greater promise was control. The box stated what additional ingredients were needed and roughly how many servings might emerge. Whether those servings satisfied a hungry teenager was another calculation entirely. Family time was changing along with the grocery list. More women entered paid employment during the 1970s, including growing numbers of mothers, although their circumstances varied enormously by income, race, region, marital status, occupation, and access to child care. Paid work did not remove the expectation that women would plan meals, shop for groceries, prepare dinner, and clean the kitchen. In many households, it simply compressed those duties into the hours before and after work. The food industry recognized the pressure and sold convenience as a solution. Advertisements showed calm cooks producing complete dinners from packages, frozen trays, and appliances with very little visible strain. Real kitchens remained less composed. Someone still had to remember to thaw the meat stop at the supermarket, find the missing can opener, settle an argument, and discover that the milk required by the box had been finished at breakfast. Convenience reduced certain steps. It rarely removed responsibility. The appliances of the decade offered their own versions of help. Slow cookers allowed stews, roast beans, and party foods to remain warm for hours, promising that dinner could cook while the household was somewhere else. Electric skillets brought frying and simmering to the countertop. Larger refrigerator freezers held fish sticks, pot pies, frozen vegetables, and television dinners, waiting for nights when the original meal plan failed. Microwave ovens began appearing in more American homes, particularly toward the later 1970s, but they were still expensive and far from universal. For many families, reheating remained the work of a saucepan skillet or conventional oven. The microwave nevertheless suggested the direction ahead: individual portions, shorter waits, and family members eating at different times. The old dinner bell had not vanished, but the kitchen was learning to accommodate a household that did not always arrive together. Supermarkets encouraged the change by offering more choices in more specialized sections. The center aisles held meal helpers, pudding mixes, canned sauces, instant potatoes, flavored rice, and products designed to turn one fresh ingredient into a complete dish. Freezer cases offered dinners in divided trays, vegetables already covered in sauce desserts ready to thaw, and snacks that moved directly from box to baking sheet. Each package carried an image of the finished meal, replacing some of the imagination once required at the grocery store. A shopper no longer had to look at ground beef and invent dinner. The box beside it had already suggested what dinners had become. This did not make every meal easier, cheaper, or better. It made the decision more visible. The supermarket was no longer simply selling ingredients. It was selling plans, portions, identities, and the comforting possibility that tonight's problem had already been solved by someone in a test kitchen. Yet the 1970s table was never one uniform national scene. Rural families, urban households, immigrant communities, regional food traditions, religious practices, and different levels of income shaped what convenience meant. One family relied on a chest freezer filled with garden produce and meat purchased in quantity. Another shopped at a neighborhood market without access to the newest national products. Some households embraced boxed meals, while others continued cooking foods that had always been quick because the techniques were familiar. Rice beans, tortillas, noodles, greens, soups, and stews could feed families efficiently without appearing in an advertisement as modern convenience. Even within one home, the table could move between generations. A grandmother's recipe appeared on Sunday, a frozen dinner on Tuesday, canned chow mein on Friday, and a slow cooker meal when company came. The decade's real story was not the victory of packaged food. It was the growing number of ways a household could combine memory, necessity, marketing, and time. By the end of the decade, the recipe box and cardboard package had learned to share the same shelf. The foods in this list reveal that partnership again and again: homemade tuna casserole held together by canned soup chicken, coated with seasoning from a packet party meatballs, glazed with 2 supermarket products, and cakes created from dry mix without conventional mixing. These meals survived because they answered ordinary pressures with practical imagination. Some became symbols of outdated cooking. Others remained so familiar that no one thought to call them historical. What faded most was the world around them. The smaller freezer crowded with foil trays, the coupon envelope near the telephone the family member expected to turn separate ingredients into dinner at the same hour every night. One final bowl waits at the end of that table. Its ingredients were older than the decade and never truly disappeared. but for many families it carried Sunday dinner church gatherings and the handwriting of someone whose recipe needed no instructions beyond bananas, pudding, and vanilla wafers. The glass bowl waited at the far end of the family table beyond the ham, green beans rolls and dishes that had already demanded most of the oven. Inside it, vanilla wafers formed a pale golden layer beneath sliced bananas and thick vanilla pudding. Another row followed, then another, until the bowl held soft yellow fruit creamy custard, and cookies arranged with enough care to suggest that everyone would receive a fair portion. In many 1970s homes, banana pudding appeared after Sunday dinner at church suppers, family reunions, funeral meals, picnics, and holiday gatherings, especially across the American South. It was not invented during the decade, and it never belonged to every household, but it fit the period perfectly. The ingredients were familiar, the bowl could feed a crowd, and the dessert became better after waiting. While most cookies were protected from moisture, vanilla wafers entered banana pudding specifically to surrender. Some families cooked the custard on the stove from milk, sugar, eggs, flour, or cornstarch and vanilla. The saucepan required steady stirring because the mixture could thicken smoothly one moment and attach itself to the bottom the next. Steam rose around the spoon, and the custard gradually changed from warm milk into something heavy enough to coat the back of it. Other households used packaged vanilla pudding, particularly when time was short or several dishes were already competing for attention. Instant pudding reduced the work further, though family loyalty often decided whether that shortcut was acceptable. A cook who had grown up with warm homemade custard might regard the packaged version as convenient but emotionally incomplete. Another family remembered only the chilled version and saw no reason to introduce a saucepan into a dessert that behaved perfectly well without one. Banana pudding tolerated both approaches because its strongest identity came from the layers rather than any single method. The wafers were placed across the bottom and sometimes stood upright around the sides of the bowl, creating a decorative border visible through the glass. Bananas were sliced only when needed because their bright surfaces began darkening soon after meeting the air. A careful cook worked quickly, covering each layer of fruit with pudding before moving to the next. The top varied according to family tradition. Some bowls received whipped cream or whipped topping and went directly into the refrigerator. Others were crowned with meringue made from beaten egg whites, and sugar then placed briefly in the oven until the peaks turned golden. A baked meringue made the dessert look formal enough for a holiday table, although cutting through it neatly was another matter. The first serving spoon usually broke the perfect surface, dragged several wafers sideways, and proved that layered desserts respected appearance only until people became hungry. Banana pudding's texture changed as it rested. At first, the wafers remained crisp around the edges, distinct from the pudding and fruit. After several hours, they absorbed moisture and softened into tender cake-like layers that could be cut with the side of a spoon. This transformation was not a failure. It was the reason many families prepared the dessert early. The banana flavor moved into the custard, the cookies lost their dry snap, and the separate ingredients settled into one cool, fragrant bowl. Timing still mattered. Served too soon, it tasted assembled rather than complete. Left too long, the bananas darkened and the wafers could become extremely soft. The ideal moment was somewhere between those conditions, usually determined less by a clock than by when the family finally finished dinner and someone remembered there was dessert in the refrigerator. At a large gathering, the bowl carried its own quiet mathematics. The first servings contained neat layers and plenty of visible wafers. The later servings came from deeper in the dish where pudding softened cookies and bananas had become less orderly, but often tasted even better. Children watched for the wafer placed along the side or the portion, with the largest banana slice. Adults claimed they wanted only a little, and then held out a bowl capable of supporting much more. A serving spoon scraped against the glass, revealing streaks where the pudding had been removed. Someone eventually tilted the bowl to collect what remained in the bottom, an action presented as helping with cleanup. Banana pudding was generous enough for a crowd, but familiar enough to feel personal. The same dessert could remind different people of a grandmother's kitchen, a church basement, a barbecue restaurant, or the folding tables at a family reunion. Its ingredients also connected several generations of American home cooking. Bananas had once been a more novel imported fruit, while commercial vanilla wafers and packaged pudding later made the dessert increasingly convenient. By the 1970s, a cook could prepare a traditional cooked custard, use a pudding mix, top the bowl with homemade meringue, or fold in whipped topping from a container. Old technique and modern convenience could occupy the same dish without requiring an argument, although families sometimes provided one anyway. The handwritten recipe card might specify cooked custard, while the supermarket package offered a faster version. Neither erased the meaning of the dessert. What people remembered was the person who made it, the bowl in which it appeared, and the certainty that the vanilla wafers would be hidden somewhere beneath the pudding. Banana pudding did not vanish after the 1970s. It remains a living Southern tradition and a familiar American dessert made at home, sold in restaurants, and adapted in countless ways. It belongs on this list not because it disappeared completely, but because the older family ritual surrounding it has become less universal. Fewer households gather for large Sunday dinners every week. Church suppers and extended family meals have changed. Supermarket desserts, bakery cakes, and individual portions often replace the deep communal bowl. Even so, banana pudding has survived more successfully than many fashionable foods from the decade because it was never only fashionable. It was inexpensive enough for ordinary gatherings, generous enough for company, and simple enough to become part of family memory. At the end of these 30 foods, the 1970s kitchen looks less like a collection of strange recipes and more like a room full of practical decisions. A cardboard box helped stretch ground beef. A casserole dish gave canned ingredients a place at the family table. Frozen trays waited for nights when schedules fell apart. Slow cookers held party food. Warm gelatin molds made modest ingredients look decorative, and cake mixes allowed dessert to happen without a mixing bowl. Not every family ate the same foods, and not every memory is warm. Some children disliked the peas. Some adults grew tired of the casseroles, and some recipes deserved to remain on the card rather than return to the table. Yet behind them stood real labor budgeting, adaptation, and care. The paper grocery bag is empty now. The foil has been folded, the serving dishes have been scraped, and the refrigerator holds only the final portion of banana pudding beneath plastic wrap. Tomorrow the wafers will be softer, and the bananas slightly darker, but someone will still open the door, find a spoon, and finish it while standing at the counter. That may be why these foods remain so powerful. Their flavors changed, their packages disappeared, and their place at the table became smaller, but the ordinary family moments attached to them stayed behind. The meals were simple, the work behind them was not, and somewhere inside an old recipe box in handwriting that becomes more valuable every year, dinner is still waiting to be made.